She handed him the keys like she was throwing scraps to a stray dog. In front of 60 wealthy guests, surrounded by champagne flutes and designer suits, Victoria Ashford laughed and pointed at the rust-eaten wreck in the corner of her garage. "Take it," she said. "Consider it a gift from someone who actually knows what things are worth." Everyone laughed. Nathan Carter didn't. He just picked up the keys, tucked them into his jacket pocket, and walked out into the cold night air without saying a single word. That was the moment a $9 million secret changed hands. Geez, and nobody in that room had any idea. If this story sounds like something worth your 2 hours, stay with me. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really began. The Ashford estate sat on 17 acres of manicured land outside of Millfield, Connecticut. And on the night of the auction, it glowed like something out of a magazine spread that most people would flip past because they couldn't afford anything inside it. Private security at the gate. Valet parking on the gravel. Waitstaff moving through the crowd with the quiet efficiency of people who had been paid well and trained better. The kind of event where the invitations arrived by courier and the dress code was black tie. But what it really meant was, don't embarrass us. Nathan Carter had not received an invitation. He'd come as a +1 for Dennis Howell, a retired mechanic turned automotive appraiser who had worked with Nathan twice before on restoration jobs. Dennis was 63 years old, walked with a slight limp from a knee surgery that hadn't quite taken, and had a habit of wearing the same brown corduroy jacket to every professional event regardless of the occasion. Tonight was no exception. "You're going to stick out," Nathan had told him in the car. "I always stick out," Dennis said. "Difference is I stopped caring about it 30 years ago." Nathan hadn't said anything to that. He was wearing a jacket he'd bought secondhand from a consignment shop in Millfield 3 years ago. Navy blue, slightly too wide in the shoulders, but clean and pressed. He had a daughter at home. He didn't spend money on clothes that weren't necessary. The auction was part estate sale, part social performance. Victoria Ashford was liquidating a portion of her late father's holdings. Not because she needed the money, but because she was redesigning the estate and didn't want the clutter. That was how one of the guests described it to another guest near the entrance, in a tone that suggested they found this both impressive and mildly absurd. Nathan heard this and said nothing. He was good at saying nothing. He'd learned it the way most people learn useful things, the hard way over time, after the alternative had cost him too much. The main auction floor was set up in what had once been a banquet hall, now cleared and laid out with numbered lots on pedestals and tables. Furniture, art, wine collections. A set of vintage timepieces in a glass case. The kind of things that accumulate around people who have more money than they have time to appreciate what they own. Dennis moved through the crowd with a clipboard, doing what appraisers do. Cataloging, assessing, making quiet notes in the margins. Nathan followed him, not because he'd been asked to, but because he was here and had nothing else to do but look. He was good at looking. It was in many ways the skill that had saved him after everything else had fallen apart. The garage was connected to the estate through a side corridor that most guests weren't bothering with. It had been included in the auction listings as a secondary space, miscellaneous vehicles and equipment sold as is. The kind of category that serious collectors sometimes ignored because it promised nothing and required effort. Nathan went there anyway. The garage held 4 vehicles in various states of preservation. A late-model Mercedes in pristine condition, 2 vintage motorcycles that had been cleaned up nicely for display. And then, shoved into the far corner behind a rolling tool chest and a stack of storage boxes, something that barely qualified as a vehicle anymore. It was long, or had been once. The body panels were eaten with rust in a way that suggested years of neglect in a space that wasn't quite dry enough. The original color was invisible under the oxidation. He couldn't tell if it had been red or brown or something else entirely. The glass was intact, which surprised him. The tires were flat and cracked, the rubber gone gray and brittle. It looked like something that had been abandoned so long ago that whoever left it there had probably forgotten they'd done it. Nathan crouched down beside the front wheel well and looked at the undercarriage. He stayed there for a long time. Dennis found him 10 minutes later, still crouched, using the flashlight on his phone to examine the frame rails. "What are you doing?" Dennis asked. "Looking at this." "At what?" "That thing's garbage." "Maybe. Nathan stood up and moved to the rear of the vehicle, crouching again at the back panel. "Come look at this seam." Dennis sighed, the sigh of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that sometimes his instincts were wrong, and walked over. He crouched. He looked at where Nathan was pointing. He was quiet for a moment. "That's hand finished," Dennis said. "Yeah." "That's not factory work." "No, it's not." They looked at each other. "What do you think it is?" Dennis asked. Nathan shook his head slowly. "I don't know yet, but someone built this by hand, or at least parts of it, and whoever did it knew what they were doing." Victoria Ashford arrived in the garage 20 minutes later, flanked by two guests Nathan later understood were a real estate developer and a hedge fund manager, and accompanied by a woman in a headset who appeared to be managing the event logistics. Victoria was 30 years old, tall, and possessed of the particular self-assurance that comes not from achievement but from never having had a reason to doubt that the world would arrange itself around her needs. She was wearing something that cost more than Nathan made in 3 months. Her hair was perfect. Her expression was the expression of someone attending their own party who has grown faintly bored of it. She scanned the garage with the mild interest of someone reviewing a property they'd already decided to sell. Then she noticed Nathan crouching beside the rusted wreck in the corner. "Can I help you?" she said. Her tone was not offering help. Nathan straightened up. "I was just looking at this vehicle." "Yes, I can see that." She tilted her head slightly. "And?" "I think it might be worth examining more closely, before the auction." One of the men beside Victoria, the real estate developer, Nathan would later learn his name was Caldwell, laughed a short, sharp laugh. Not a mean laugh, exactly, but the kind that comes reflexively when something strikes you as absurd. Victoria's expression shifted into something that resembled amusement. "Worth examining," she repeated. "The craftsmanship on the frame suggests it's a piece of rust," she said. Clearly. Pleasantly, almost. "My father collected things. Sometimes things that had no value. That particular thing has been sitting in this garage for as long as I can remember, taking up space and being an eyesore, and I've been meaning to have it hauled to a salvage yard for years." She looked at the car the way you look at a piece of furniture you've decided to throw out. "Are you a mechanic?" "I restore vehicles." She studied him for a moment. The second-hand jacket, the calloused hands, the absence of a cocktail. She had apparently seen everything she needed to see. "Well, I appreciate the enthusiasm." More guests had filtered into the garage now, drawn by the noise or by boredom or by the social gravity that pulls people toward wherever something interesting might be happening. There were maybe 15 or 20 people now, clustered near the entrance and along the walls, watching. Nathan recognized this dynamic. He'd grown up poor enough to understand the way rooms shift when a person without money says something a person with money finds presumptuous. He should have let it go. He knew he should have. But he was looking at the seam again, but the perfectly fitted, hand-finished seam on the rear quarter panel, and he couldn't quite make himself stop. "The rear bodywork," he said. "It's hand-fitted. That's not something you see on production vehicles. And the frame rails have a specific geometry that—" "Sir?" Victoria's voice was still pleasant. That was somehow worse than if she'd been sharp. "I've had this estate assessed by professionals, multiple times. If there was anything of value in this garage, I assure you they would have found it. With respect, they might not have known what to look for." The room was quiet, in the specific way rooms go quiet, when someone says something that other people find either brave or very stupid, and nobody's decided which yet. Victoria looked at Nathan for a long moment. Then she smiled. It was a real smile, which made it worse. "All right," she said. She looked at the woman with the headset. "Pull this lot from the auction." The woman with the headset made a note. Victoria walked to the vehicle and lifted the keys from the hook on the nearby pegboard. A simple keyring with 2 keys on it, one of them old enough that the teeth were worn smooth. She walked back across the garage floor, her heels clicking precisely on the concrete, and held them out to Nathan. "It's yours," she said. "A gift, from someone who knows what things are worth." The room laughed. Not cruelly. It wasn't a cruel crowd, exactly, but the way people laugh when someone in a position of power lands a joke at the expense of someone who has less of it, And it's easier to laugh along than to be the person who doesn't. Caldwell laughed. The hedge fund manager laughed. Several of the guests along the wall laughed. Dennis, standing at the back, did not laugh. Nathan looked at the keys in Victoria's hand for a moment. Then he reached out and took them. "Thank you," he said. He said it quietly, without irony, without edge. Just 2 words, delivered like they meant exactly what they said. He put the keys in his jacket pocket, gave Dennis a small nod, and walked out of the garage. Behind him, the laughter continued for another few seconds, and then it faded, and people went back to their drinks and their conversations and their lives. Nobody thought about it again that night. Nathan's workshop occupied the back portion of a rented commercial space in the industrial section of Millfield, a neighborhood of warehouses and auto body shops and the kind of small businesses that don't have signs out front because their customers already know where they are. He'd rented it 7 years ago, when he was still doing well enough that the rent wasn't frightening. He kept it now through a combination of stubbornness and economies he didn't talk about. The landlord, a Slovak man in his 70s named Bresnik, had twice offered to reduce the rent and been refused both times. Nathan didn't like owing favors. He'd had enough of that to last him. He had the rusted vehicle towed to the workshop 3 days after the auction. It arrived on a flatbed in the early morning while his daughter, Lily, was at school. Lily was 8 years old. She had her mother's eyes and Nathan's habit of focusing completely on whatever was in front of her and appearing to outside observers to be somewhere else entirely. She already knew the names of more car parts than most adults. She spent Saturday mornings in the workshop with him, sitting on an overturned bucket with a book open on her lap, occasionally asking questions that were better than the questions most grown men asked. Nathan had arranged his entire life around Lily since the accident. This was not something he thought of as sacrifice. It was just the shape his life had taken, and he had made his peace with that shape, though the making of that peace had taken longer than he liked to remember. He stood in front of the rusted vehicle for a while before he touched it. He did this with every restoration. Just looked, first. Let the object tell him what it was before he started asking questions of it. His first mentor, an old German engineer named Casper, who had worked at a chassis fabrication shop in Stuttgart before emigrating, had taught him this. "The machine knows what it is," Casper used to say, in the flat, deliberate English of a man who had learned the language late. "Your job is to listen before you start talking." Nathan had thought this was sentimental nonsense when he was 23. He thought differently now. He pulled on his work gloves and began at the front. The first thing he noticed, up close and in proper light, was that the vehicle was longer than it had appeared in the Ashford garage. The rust obscured proportion. It made the eye see mass without dimension. But now, with a tape measure, he confirmed that the wheelbase was unusual. Not impossibly so, but outside the range of anything he could identify from memory as a standard production model. Custom, then. Or modified. Or something else entirely. He worked methodically, moving from front to rear and then underneath, cataloging observations without drawing conclusions. He had a notebook for this, a plain composition book he used for every project, his handwriting small and precise, almost architectural. Wheelbase, 118 inches. Unusual for era suggested by exterior design cues. Frame material. Appears to be high-strength steel alloy, not standard mild steel of apparent period. Requires testing. Bodywork. Significant corrosion surface level, but underlying structure appears largely intact. Unusual for this degree of exterior neglect. Weld seams. Mixed. Factory quality in some areas, hand-finished in others. Not consistent with production vehicle. Component configuration. Unfamiliar. We'll need to examine mechanicals. He was 3 pages into his notes when he found the first altered serial number. It was stamped on the firewall in the engine bay, in the location where a VIN plate would typically be. The number itself was present. It hadn't been removed or ground off, the way stolen vehicles sometimes were, but the last 4 digits had been re-stamped. Not clumsily. Someone had done it carefully, with proper tools. If you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it. Nathan photographed it from 3 angles. Then he found the second one, on the frame rail beneath the driver's seat, and the third on a bracket inside the trunk. He sat back on his heels in the trunk space and stared at the bracket for a long time. Altered serial numbers on a vehicle could mean several things, Theft, historically, was the most common. But that didn't fit what he was seeing. The quality of the work, the apparent age, the fact that the alterations had been done with real precision. This wasn't someone covering tracks in a hurry. This was someone deliberately obscuring identity. Carefully. Over time. Why would someone hide what this car was? He was at the kitchen table that evening, the composition book open in front of him, when Lily came downstairs in her pajamas. It was past 9. She was supposed to be asleep. "You're still up," Nathan said. "You're still up," she said back. She climbed onto the chair across from him and pulled her knees to her chest. She had a stuffed rabbit she'd owned since she was 2. She was growing out of it, was already sometimes embarrassed to be seen with it. But she had it now, tucked under her arm. "What's in the notebook?" she asked. "Work stuff." "The new car?" "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment, in the way she got quiet when she was deciding whether to say something. "Mrs. Briggs said you were on the news." Nathan looked up. "What?" "The auction. Someone filmed it. She saw it at her book club." Lily's expression was carefully neutral, the expression of a child trying to relay information without editorializing. "She said some lady gave you a broken car to be funny." Nathan set down his pen. "Did she? Was it mean?" He thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was complicated. "The lady thought it was a joke," he said. "She thought there was nothing valuable in it." "Was she wrong?" "I think so. I'm not sure how wrong yet." Lily considered this. "Did it bother you when she laughed?" He looked at his daughter. She was asking because she genuinely wanted to know, and because she was 8 years old and still believed that you could ask adults how they felt and get honest answers. "A little," he said. "Yeah." She nodded, as though this confirmed something she'd suspected. Then she said, "Is it a famous car?" "I don't know yet. Maybe." "How do you find out?" "I look for people who know more than me, and I ask questions." She appeared to accept this. She yawned, covering her mouth with the rabbit's ear the way she always did when she was embarrassed to be caught yawning. "Go to bed," Nathan said. "Okay." She climbed down from the chair, paused at the kitchen doorway. "Dad?" "Yeah." "She was wrong, though, right? About the car." He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "She was wrong." Lily nodded once, satisfied, and went upstairs. Nathan sat alone at the table for another hour, staring at the notebook, turning over everything he'd found. Dennis Howell came to the workshop 4 days later at Nathan's request. He spent 2 hours examining the vehicle, which Nathan had partially disassembled. Hood removed, front clip taken off, engine bay exposed, and said very little during the process. When he was done, he sat on a stool and took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Okay," he said. "Okay, what?" "Okay, you were right, and I was wrong, and I should have looked closer when we were at the estate." He put his glasses back on. "What are you thinking?" "Prototype," Nathan said. Dennis was quiet. "Custom chassis, hand-finished bodywork in specific areas, non-standard alloys in the frame construction," Nathan said. "The powertrain configuration doesn't match anything in production from the apparent era. And I've looked. The serial alterations were done deliberately and carefully. This wasn't a consumer vehicle. This was an engineering exercise, or a one-off build." "From when?" "Somewhere between 1978 and 1985, based on the materials and some of the design language. But that's a rough estimate. I need a metallurgical analysis on the frame." Dennis picked up one of the photographs Nathan had printed, the altered serial number on the firewall. He looked at it for a long time. "You know what the altered numbers mean," Dennis said. It wasn't a question. "Someone wanted this car to not be findable," Nathan said. "Someone deliberately obscured its identity, not quickly and not sloppily. They did it like they were going to spend the rest of their life making sure nobody connected the car to whatever it had been." "Ashford," Dennis said. "That's where I keep landing." "Edward Ashford was a mechanic before he was anything else," Dennis said. He was speaking carefully, in the way people speak when they're reconstructing something from memory. "I knew people who knew him. Not well, but peripherally. In the early days, before the money. He came up through manufacturing, right? industrial fabrication. He had an engineering background, Nathan said. I looked into him after the auction. Before the companies, before the empire, he was doing custom fabrication work out of a shop in New Jersey. Small operation, 1 or 2 employees. When was that? Late 70s, early 80s? They looked at each other. If he built something during that period, Nathan said, something significant, something that for whatever reason he didn't want anyone to find, he could have hidden it in plain sight, Dennis said, in his own garage, covered in rust, where nobody would look twice. He paused, and then died, and left it to a daughter who didn't know what she had. Dennis set the photograph down. He looked at the partially disassembled vehicle for a long moment. Nathan, he said, yeah, you know this is potentially enormous. If you're right, I know. And she gave it to you, legally, in front of witnesses. I know. So it's yours. Nathan nodded slowly. He'd thought about this, of course. Had spent considerable time thinking about it, lying awake at 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling. A single father with a rented workshop and a second-hand jacket. The possible possession of something worth more than he'd made in the last decade combined. It's mine, he said, but I want to understand what it is first. Why? Because it came from somewhere, Nathan said, and before I decide what to do with it, I want to know where. He spent the next 3 weeks systematically dismantling the vehicle's secrets. The metallurgical analysis came back first. A professor at the University of Connecticut, a materials scientist named Dr. Patricia Osai, who did occasional consulting work for automotive historians, examined samples from the frame rails and returned a finding that confirmed what Nathan had suspected. The steel alloy composition was consistent with experimental high-strength materials being developed in the early 1980s, not commercially available at the time, primarily produced for aerospace and specialized industrial applications. This is not a consumer vehicle, she wrote in her report. The material choices suggest access to industrial manufacturing resources and engineering knowledge well beyond a typical custom build. Whoever built this was either working with or had significant access to advanced fabrication technology for the period. Nathan read the report 3 times. Then he started on the archives. He spent evenings at the Millfield Public Library and nights at his kitchen table, working through digitized automotive history records, patent filings from the late 1970s through mid-1980s, trade publications, engineering journals. He contacted an automotive historian at the Smithsonian who pointed him toward a private collector in Michigan, who pointed him toward an archivist in Stuttgart, who pointed him toward a set of records that had never been fully cataloged. The clearer picture that emerged was this. In 1981, there had been a small but significant movement among independent engineers and fabricators to develop an advanced chassis platform that could bridge the gap between racing technology and road-going performance cars. Not for any single manufacturer, the project had been deliberately kept outside the traditional automotive industry, funded by a consortium of private investors and developed in secrecy. The reasons for the secrecy varied depending on who you asked. Some sources said it was competitive. Some suggested there had been legal complications. Some simply didn't know. The project had produced at least one completed prototype, and then in 1983, all records of it stopped. Not gradually, abruptly. The engineers involved had moved on to other projects. The investors had redirected their money. The paperwork had simply ended. Nathan found one reference, a single paragraph in a 1984 trade journal, to a prototype that had been described as the most technically significant automotive development of its decade by one of the engineers involved before being denied and retracted in the following issue. He photographed the paragraph. He printed it. He pinned it above his workbench. The secret compartment took him by surprise. He had been working on the trunk interior, removing the deteriorated lining to assess the structural condition beneath, when his screwdriver encountered resistance behind a false panel that his eye had read as part of the body structure. He stopped. He set down the screwdriver. He found a flashlight. The compartment was not large, perhaps 18 inches wide, 12 inches deep, built into the space behind the rear seat back, invisible unless you were actively removing the interior panels. It had been sealed with a simple mechanical latch, the kind that required knowing where to press rather than any key or combination. Inside the compartment, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept them largely dry despite everything. A leather-bound journal. Not new. The leather was worn and darkened, the spine cracked from repeated opening. Several hundred pages filled with close handwriting in blue ink. A manila envelope sealed. Inside, 23 photographs. Black and white, some of them, and color prints of others. The color faded to the particular yellow-green of early 1980s photography. The photographs showed a vehicle in various stages of construction in what appeared to be a small utilitarian workshop, not the Ashford estate. Somewhere earlier, somewhere poorer, and a bundle of letters bound with a rubber band that disintegrated when he touched it, tied together with a piece of twine underneath. Nathan held the journal for a long time without opening it. He looked at the cover. There was a name written on the inside front page, in the same handwriting as the rest of it. Edward R. Ashford, 1981. Nathan set the journal down on the workbench. He sat on his stool. Outside, the street was quiet. The fluorescent light above him hummed its single monotonous note. Somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking at something, and then stopping, and then barking again. He thought about Victoria Ashford, standing in her garage with her perfect posture and her pleasant cruelty, holding out those keys like a punchline. He thought about Lily upstairs, asking him if the woman had been wrong. He thought about Edward Ashford, a mechanic from New Jersey, before the empire, before the money, who had built something extraordinary and then spent 30 years making sure no one could find it. He opened the journal. The handwriting was precise and slightly tilted to the right, the handwriting of someone who had learned penmanship properly and then spent years fighting it back toward efficiency. The first entry was dated March 4th, 1981. Started on the chassis modifications today. Henriksen came by to look at the frame jigs. He thinks the geometry is too aggressive for road use, but he doesn't understand what I'm trying to do. This isn't about road use. This is about proving what's possible. If someone else has to make it practical afterward, that's fine with me. The steel is extraordinary. I've never worked with anything like it. I keep thinking about what my father would say if he could see this shop, see what we're building. He thought I wasted my time learning engineering. He wanted me to take over the hardware store. I didn't take over the hardware store. Nathan read slowly. He wasn't in a hurry. The early entries were technical, detailed descriptions of fabrication processes, material challenges, the particular engineering problems that came with building something that had no template. But they were also personal in a way he hadn't expected. Edward Ashford wrote the way people write when they don't think anyone else will ever read it, unguarded, sometimes self-contradictory, occasionally rambling in ways that revealed the actual texture of a mind working through problems in real time. He wrote about money worries, about a partner who had pulled out of the project in June of that year and the subsequent need to restructure the financing, about a weld that had cracked on the fourth attempt, and the 2 days he'd spent trying to understand why before realizing the issue wasn't in the weld at all, but in the thermal preparation of the surrounding material. And in between the engineering, he wrote about a daughter. Victoria started walking last week. Claire called me at the shop to tell me, and I was in the middle of the frame alignment and I told her I'd be home in an hour. I wasn't. I was home in 4 hours. Victoria was asleep by then. I keep thinking I'll make up for it when the project is finished. I keep saying that. When the project is finished. Nathan stopped at that entry and read it twice. He understood what that felt like, the arithmetic men do with their time and attention, the constant calculation of later, afterward, when this is done. He had done it too, before the accident, before everything had reorganized itself around a single impossible fact. He had been good at telling himself it was temporary, that the balance would right itself, that Lily would understand one day. Lily had been 5 months old when her mother died. She wouldn't understand anything. She would just grow up with whatever version of her father showed up, and the showing up was everything. Nathan thought about this for a moment. Then he kept reading. The entries grew shorter as the year progressed, the compression of someone who had less time and more urgency. By the fall of 1981, the technical entries were sparse, replaced by something rawer. October 17th. Tested the suspension geometry on the runway outside Bridgeport. Henriksen was there with his stopwatch and his clipboard, and when the numbers came in, he just looked at me for a moment and didn't say anything. That moment was worth more than the last 6 months. October 31st, Victoria was a pumpkin for Halloween. Claire took pictures. I saw them later. I wasn't there. November 8th, the investors are getting nervous. Morrow keeps asking about timelines. I don't have timelines. I have a car that doesn't exist yet, and a set of engineering specifications that nobody in the industry will believe until they see it. November 22nd, received a letter from Kellerman's legal team today. They're claiming priority on the chassis geometry patents. An obvious lie, but an expensive lie to fight. Morrow says we should settle. I said no. The argument lasted 45 minutes and ended with him walking out. Nathan read that entry twice. Kellerman. He'd seen that name in the archived trade publications. A mid-sized automotive supplier that had been absorbed into a larger conglomerate in the late 1980s. The legal dispute would explain some of the secrecy, some of the alterations to the serial numbers. If the patent fight had gone badly, he kept reading. December 3rd, 1981. Morrow and the consortium formally withdrew today. Took the financing with them. I have roughly 6 weeks of operating capital left, possibly less. Henriksen says he'll stay on without salary until we figure something out. I told him not to do that. He said he'd already decided. December 19th. Morrow has apparently been talking to Kellerman's people. I don't know what he's told them. I don't know how much they know. Henriksen thinks we should finish the car and document everything before they can claim anything. December 28th. She said her first word today. Claire called me at the shop. The word was da. It might have been dad. Claire thinks it was. Victoria was pointing at a photograph of me on the refrigerator. I was at the shop. Nathan set the journal down. He sat for a long time in the quiet of the workshop. Outside, the dog had stopped barking. The street was completely silent. He thought about a man in a small New Jersey workshop, alone in the last days of December 1981, building something extraordinary and losing something ordinary. The trade he was making without fully understanding that it was a trade. He thought about the keys, hanging on the pegboard in the Ashford garage for 40 years, waiting. He picked up the journal again. He had a lot more pages to go. The journal had 340 pages. Nathan read all of them over the course of 9 days, not consecutively, but in pieces. An hour before Lily woke up, another hour after she went to bed, sometimes a chunk on Sunday afternoons when she was at his sister-in-law's house for her weekly visit. He read slowly, which was unusual for him. He was not ordinarily a slow reader, but the journal demanded slowness the way certain objects demand careful handling, not because they're fragile exactly, but because you understand somehow that rushing would be a kind of disrespect. Edward Ashford had not written it for an audience. That much was clear from the first pages and became clearer with every subsequent entry. There was no performance in it, none of the self-consciousness that creeps into writing when you suspect someone will eventually read it. He wrote the way men of his generation were sometimes permitted to write, only when they were absolutely certain no one was watching. Honestly, incompletely, with gaps and contradictions, and the occasional sentence that trailed off because the thought had outrun the ability or the willingness to finish it. By the time Nathan reached the final entry, dated November 14th, 1983, he felt he understood Edward Ashford better than he understood most living people he knew, which was a strange feeling, which he did not entirely know what to do with. The final entry was short, shorter than most of the others. The car is done, or as done as it's going to be. Henriksen says it's the finest thing either of us will ever touch, and he might be right. I've arranged for the serial documentation to be altered. Petrakis handled it, he knows what he's doing, and he's not going to talk. Kellerman's people have been quiet for 3 months now, which could mean they've moved on or could mean they're waiting. Either way, the car goes into storage. The Fairfield property has a garage that nobody uses. I'll have it moved there. I've been thinking about what to do with the journals, the photographs, the letters I never sent. I could destroy everything. That would be the practical choice. But I spent 3 years building something I believed in, and I don't think I can make myself pretend it never existed. So I'll hide it instead. In the car. Inside the thing itself. That seems right. Victoria said workshop today. Not clearly. She garbled the middle syllable the way she still does with long words, but she said it. Claire told me later that it's because she hears me mention it so often. I don't know what I'm leaving her. I don't know what any of this adds up to, or if it adds up to anything at all. But I built the thing. That's real. Whatever else I do or don't do, whatever else gets taken or lost or argued away, I built it, and it exists, and for 3 years it was the best work of my life. That has to count for something. Nathan closed the journal. He sat in the workshop with it on his lap for a while, not thinking anything in particular, just sitting with the weight of it. Then he picked up his phone and called Dennis. "I need you to come back," he said when Dennis answered. "I found something." "How bad is it?" "It's not bad, I need you to see it." There was a pause. "I'll come tomorrow morning." "Yeah," Nathan said, "bring coffee. It's going to take a while to explain." Dennis came the next morning with 2 cups from the diner on Chester Street and the expression of a man who had learned over 63 years to brace himself when people said things were going to take a while. He sat on the same stool he'd occupied during his first visit and listened without interruption while Nathan walked him through everything. The metallurgical analysis, the archived records, the patent dispute, and finally the compartment and its contents. Nathan set the journal, the envelope of photographs, and the bundle of letters on the workbench between them. Dennis looked at them for a moment. Then he picked up one of the photographs, a black and white image of the car in an early stage of construction, the bare chassis sitting on jack stands in what was clearly a small workshop, a young man visible in the background crouching over something with a welding torch. "That's him?" Dennis asked. "Edward?" "I think so. The timeline fits." Dennis studied the photograph. The young man in it was lean, dark-haired, not yet wearing the particular authority that Nathan had seen in the later photographs of Edward Ashford, the billionaire, the industrialist, the man whose name was on buildings and foundations and hospital wings. This was a different version of him, earlier, before. "He looks 25, Dennis said. "He was 27 in 1981. I checked." Dennis set the photograph down carefully. He picked up his coffee and held it in both hands and looked at the disassembled vehicle across the workshop. "You understand what you have here?" "I'm starting to." "Nathan." Dennis's voice had shifted slightly. Not alarmed exactly, but careful. The way you get careful when you're near something that could go wrong in multiple directions. This isn't just a restoration find. This is potentially a historical artifact with legal and financial implications that are, I know, significantly above my pay grade as a consultant. I know. You need a lawyer. I know. And you need to contact automotive historians, real ones, not just Dr. Osei. She was helpful, but this is beyond materials analysis now. You need someone who specializes in prototype documentation, in provenance verification. "I already made some calls," Nathan said. "There's a man in Chicago, Marcus Webb. He's written 3 books on prototype vehicles. He consults for major auction houses. He's agreed to come look at the car." Dennis blinked. "When?" "Thursday." "This Thursday?" "Yeah." Dennis looked at him for a moment with an expression Nathan couldn't quite read. "You've been busy." "I've been thorough," Nathan said. There was a small distinction there that he felt was worth making. Dennis drank his coffee, set the cup down, picked up the journal and looked at the cover. "Have you read all of this?" "Yes." "And?" Nathan thought about how to answer that. He thought about December 28th, 1981, and the word DA and the refrigerator photograph. He thought about a man writing about his daughter in the margins of an engineering log, the 2 threads of his life running parallel on the same pages without ever quite touching. "He was complicated," Nathan said finally. "He was brilliant and driven, and he was not. He wasn't always there when he should have been. For her, for Victoria." He paused, but he knew it. He wrote about it. He wasn't someone who didn't notice what he was doing. "Knowing you're doing something and stopping are different things," Dennis said. "Yeah," Nathan said. "They are." Dennis set the journal back on the workbench. "Does she know? Victoria?" "No." "Are you going to tell her?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what Marcus Webb says on Thursday." Marcus Webb was 58 years old, built like a former linebacker gone slightly to seed, and possessed of an encyclopedic memory for automotive history that operated like a search engine. You gave him a fragment of information, and he returned the full context within seconds. He arrived at the workshop at 8 in the morning, earlier than arranged, and spent 4 hours with the vehicle before he said anything of substance. Nathan had learned in his years of doing this work that experts fell into two categories: those who talked while they worked, filling the silence with running commentary that was really just thinking out loud, and those who went completely quiet. Webb was the second type. He moved through the disassembled vehicle with a small flashlight and a magnifying glass and a digital camera, crouching and straightening and crouching again, occasionally making a sound, a low exhale, or a short, sharp intake of breath that suggested he was finding things that registered, but he offered nothing in the way of interpretation. Nathan sat on his stool and read a paperback he'd been working through for 2 weeks and let the man work. At noon, Webb straightened up from the engine bay, put both hands on his lower back, and made the sound that men of a certain age make when they've been bent over for too long. He looked across the workshop at Nathan. "You have any more of that coffee?" he asked. "From this morning." "That's fine." Nathan poured him a cup. Webb took it, pulled up a second stool, and sat down heavily. He looked at his own hands for a moment, the habit of someone organizing their thoughts before they speak. "Okay," he said. "Tell me what you think you have." "You first," Nathan said. Webb looked at him. A slight smile. "Fair enough." He drank some of the coffee, set the cup on the workbench. "What you have," he said, "is almost certainly the Meridian prototype, which is a name most people in this industry haven't heard, because it was deliberately removed from the historical record in 1983, and the people involved had sufficient resources to make that removal fairly thorough." Nathan said nothing. The Meridian project, Webb continued, was a private engineering initiative, early 1980s, funded by a small consortium of investors and developed by a team of independent engineers. The goal was a chassis platform that combined racing-derived suspension geometry with road-going durability and a power-to-weight ratio that would have been, for 1983, genuinely extraordinary. He paused. One prototype was completed. It disappeared from the record in late 1983, concurrent with a patent dispute and the dissolution of the funding consortium. Several people in the industry spent years afterward trying to track it down. The prevailing assumption was that it had been destroyed, either deliberately or through neglect. "It wasn't destroyed," Nathan said. "No," Webb said. "It was not." He looked across the workshop at the vehicle. "It was hidden, remarkably well." Another pause. "May I ask how you came to have it?" Nathan gave him the short version, the auction, the keys, the second-hand jacket. Webb listened without expression. When Nathan finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She gave it to you." "In front of 20 witnesses." Webb nodded slowly. "And the documentation? The journals?" "I have them." "The photographs?" "All of them." Webb set down his coffee cup. He had the expression of a man doing calculations, not just financial ones, though those were clearly part of it. He was assessing something more complex. "Nathan," he said, "I need to be direct with you." "Please." "What you have here is, in my professional assessment, the most significant automotive find of the last 20 years, possibly longer." He said it the way you say something that sounds outrageous but is simply true. No inflation, no performance. The Meridian prototype was already significant in engineering terms. The documentation you've recovered, the original journals, the photographs, the provenance materials, elevates it to something else entirely. You're not just talking about a rare vehicle, you're talking about a historically documented artifact with a complete and verifiable narrative. The workshop was quiet. Outside, a truck rumbled past on the street. "What's it worth?" Nathan asked. "At auction, with proper provenance, documentation, and preparation?" Webb looked at the car again. "Conservative estimate, $6 million. Realistic ceiling, considerably higher. The right buyer, the right context, could go to 9, 10, maybe more." Nathan did not react outwardly. Inwardly, something shifted, like a piece of furniture moved in a room you've lived in for a long time. The familiar suddenly configured differently. And the legal situation? He said. The vehicle was legally transferred to you as a gift, in front of witnesses by the owner of record. The serial alterations are a historical matter, not a current legal issue. The statute of limitations on anything related to the original patent dispute expired decades ago. The documentation in the hidden compartment was contained within the vehicle at the time of transfer, which makes it part of the gift. He paused. You'd want an attorney to review the specifics, but my understanding is that your claim is straightforward. I already have an attorney looking at it, Nathan said. Webb nodded again. He seemed unsurprised. He'd been taking Nathan's measure since he arrived, and he appeared to have arrived at a conclusion. You've been careful about this. I try to be. Most people in your situation would have gone to the press immediately. I'm not most people, Nathan said, not with any particular pride, just as a statement of fact. Webb stood up, replaced the stool, and looked one more time at the vehicle. He was quiet for a long moment. What do you intend to do? He asked, not asking about the money, asking something else. Nathan thought about the journal, about the final entry, about a man who built something and knew it was real and needed that to count for something. I intend to understand it first, he said, and then decide. Webb nodded. He picked up his camera bag. I'd like to be involved, if you'll allow it, officially. Whatever comes next. I'll think about it. Webb offered his hand. Nathan shook it. Webb left, and Nathan stood alone in the workshop in the particular silence that follows a conversation that has changed the shape of things. He stood there for a while. Then he went back to work. The news broke 11 days later. Nathan had not broken it. Dr. Osei had mentioned the material analysis to a colleague at a conference in Boston, not identifying the project specifically, but describing the findings in enough detail that someone in the room, a journalist who also happened to be an automotive enthusiast, connected it to a rumor they'd heard the previous month about a significant find in Connecticut. The journalist made 3 phone calls. Then they published. The headline, as these things go, was restrained. Lost prototype may have surfaced in Connecticut. Automotive world watching. But the automotive press is its own ecosystem, and the story moved through it with the speed of something people had been half waiting for. By the following morning, it had migrated to the mainstream news. By the afternoon, it was on 3 television networks. Nathan found out from Lily. She came home from school that afternoon and set her backpack on the kitchen chair and looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. There are people outside the workshop, she said. What kind of people? Camera people and regular people standing outside. He got in his car and drove to the workshop and found 6 journalists, 2 television news vans, and a small cluster of people who appeared to be there simply because other people were, which is how these things accumulate. He parked 2 blocks away, called Dennis, and said, I need help. I saw the news, Dennis said. I didn't talk to anyone. I know. It doesn't matter now. What do you need? I need someone to talk to them so I don't have to. Dennis came within the hour and handled the journalists with the ease of someone who had nothing at stake and therefore nothing to protect. He told them that Nathan Carter had no comment at this time. He told them that this vehicle was being assessed by professionals. He told them that any statement would come through proper channels when there was something to say. He did all of this pleasantly, with his hands in the pockets of his corduroy jacket, and when they kept asking the same questions in different configurations, he simply repeated the same answers until they got bored or frustrated enough to leave. Afterward, in the workshop with the blinds down, he looked at Nathan and said, This is going to get worse before it gets better. I know. You need to get ahead of it. I know. Have you thought about how you want to play this? I've thought about it, Nathan said. He'd been thinking about it for 11 days, actually, since the morning after Webb's visit, when the shape of what was coming had started to become clear. He'd thought about it at the kitchen table in the mornings, and in the workshop in the evenings, and in the car during the school run when Lily was telling him about something that happened in art class, and he was listening to her and thinking about it at the same time, which wasn't his best quality as a father, but was an honest description of where his head was. There's something I need to do first, Nathan said. Dennis waited. I need to contact Victoria Ashford. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man choosing his words carefully. Why? Dennis said finally. Because of the journals. Nathan sat down on the stool. He was tired, the particular tiredness of the last 2 weeks, which was not physical. She doesn't know what her father built. She doesn't know what's in those pages. She thinks she knew him, and she didn't. Or she knew one version of him and not another. He paused. And she's going to find all of this out eventually, from a journalist or from a press release or from the television, and that... He stopped. That's not right. Dennis looked at him for a long moment. Nathan, he said, she humiliated you in front of a room full of people. Yeah. You don't owe her anything. I know that. So this is, what, principle? Nathan thought about it. He thought about December 28th, 1981, and a man at a workbench writing about his daughter. He thought about a word, da, or maybe dad, and a photograph on a refrigerator, and a man who wasn't there to hear it because he was at the shop. It's not principle exactly, he said. It's just, she should know, before everyone else does. She should know what he was thinking about all those years. He looked at the journal on the workbench. She should know he thought about her. Dennis was quiet for another moment. Then he exhaled slowly and said, You know she's going to try to get the car back. Probably. She's going to offer you money. I know. And if you've already notified her, she's going to have lawyers involved within 24 hours. I know, Dennis. Dennis picked up his coffee, looked into it, set it down. You're a pain in my neck, you know that? You've mentioned it. I'll reach out to her office through a contact I have, more professional than you calling directly. Less room for misinterpretation. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just don't do anything I'm going to regret. The call with Victoria Ashford's office happened 2 days later, arranged through an intermediary and conducted initially between lawyers. Nathan's attorney, a dry, efficient woman named Sandra Park, who had been recommended by Marcus Webb, handled the preliminary contact and reported back that Victoria's legal team had responded within 2 hours, which confirmed Dennis's prediction, and that Victoria herself had requested a direct meeting. She wants to come to the workshop, Sandra told him on the phone. Of course she does, Nathan said. She wants to see what she gave away. Is that a yes? He thought about it. Tell them she can come. Thursday, 2 o'clock. I'll be here. Do you want me there? No, I want to talk to her without lawyers in the room. Sandra was quiet for a moment in the way lawyers are quiet when they think you're making a mistake but recognize that telling you so is outside their authority. I'll be available by phone, she said. I know, thank you. He spent the 2 days before the meeting doing what he always did when he was anxious about something. He worked. He continued the careful restoration documentation, photographing each component as it was cleaned and assessed, building the provenance record that Marcus Webb had told him would be essential for any auction process. He worked on the mechanical systems, which were in better condition than the exterior had suggested. Edward Ashford had apparently stored the vehicle with care, despite the rust that had accumulated on the body panels. The engine, when he finally turned it over for the first time, had the deep, particular sound of something built to last. Not flashy, purposeful. The sound of engineering that had been designed to work rather than to impress. Lily heard it from the doorway. She had come with him to the workshop that Saturday morning. As she usually did on the Saturdays, she didn't have other plans, and she'd been sitting on her overturned bucket with a book about marine biology she'd recently become interested in. When the engine turned over, she looked up from the book with an expression of genuine attention. It started? She said. First time, Nathan said. He was listening, his hand resting lightly on the hood. 40+ years. Turned right over. Lily set the book down and walked over. She stood next to him and they both listened for a moment. The idle, the rhythm of it, the particular voice of a machine that had been built with intention. It sounds angry, Lily said. Nathan almost smiled. It sounds ready, he said. Lily looked at him. Are you ready? For Thursday? He glanced at her. How do you know about Thursday? I heard you on the phone with the lawyer lady. She shrugged, unapologetic. Are you? I don't know, he said honestly. She thought about that for a moment. What do you want to happen? I want her to understand something about her father, he said. That's all. Lily looked at the running engine, then back at him. That's not nothing, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. He switched the engine off. The workshop went quiet again. Outside, the morning was gray and cold, the sky the particular white that precedes snow. Lily went back to her marine biology book, and Nathan went back to his documentation, and the workshop settled into its usual Saturday rhythm, which was the closest thing to peace he had found in a long time. His daughter reading in the corner, his hands doing work that meant something, the cold outside and the warmth in. He tried not to think too hard about what Thursday would bring. He failed at this, but he tried. Victoria Ashford arrived at 2 o'clock on Thursday exactly, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected her to be late in the way people who have no reason to accommodate others tend to be late, but she was punctual. She came without a lawyer, which surprised him more. She came in a black car that she drove herself, which surprised him most. She stood in the workshop doorway for a moment before entering, looking at the space with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize, not disdain, or at least not only disdain. Something more complicated than that. Mr. Carter, she said. Ms. Ashford. He gestured at the stool Dennis used. Do you want to sit? She looked at the stool. She was wearing clothes that were less formal than the night of the auction. Dark trousers, a gray coat, boots that looked expensive but practical. Her hair was pulled back. She looked, he thought, like someone who had been told the meeting was casual and had made an effort to dress accordingly without being entirely sure what casual meant in this context. Sure, she said. She sat. He sat on his own stool. Between them, on the workbench, he'd laid out the journal, the photographs, and the bundle of letters. He'd thought about how to arrange them, what order to present them in, whether to lead with the vehicle's history or with the personal materials. He'd gone back and forth on it for 2 days. In the end, he'd decided to just let her look. Victoria looked at the items on the workbench. Something moved through her expression, brief and quickly controlled. She looked at the journal, the worn leather spine, the name on the cover. That's his handwriting, she said quietly. Yes. She didn't reach for it. Not immediately. She looked at the photographs instead, reached out and turned one over, a color print showing the car in an early stage of construction, her father young and dark-haired in the background. She looked at it for a long time. How old is he here? She asked. 27, maybe 28. She set it down, picked up another. This one was later in the construction process, the car more complete, her father standing beside it with his arms crossed in an expression of concentrated satisfaction that Nathan had seen in the journal's later entries. I've never seen this photograph, she said. There are 23 in the envelope. I don't think any of them were widely shared. She set that one down too. She looked at the journal again. Can I read it? That's why I asked you here. She looked at him then, directly, the way she hadn't quite done at the auction. She was reassessing him. He could see it, and he didn't particularly mind it. He'd been reassessed before. You could have sold this without telling me anything, she said. I know. Your lawyer would have advised you to do that. She did advise me to do that. Victoria was quiet. Why didn't you? Nathan thought about the answer to that. He thought about the honest version, which was complicated and would take longer than a single sentence to explain. He thought about the simplified version, which would fit in a sentence but wouldn't quite be true. Because there's a difference, he said slowly, between what something is worth and what it means. And the second thing, that's yours. Whatever happens with the car, whatever happens at auction, whatever the lawyers work out, the second thing is yours. He left it for you. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, not breaking, not yet, but moving. A small tectonic adjustment. She reached across the workbench and picked up the journal. She opened it to the first page. She began to read. Nathan got up quietly, went to the small corner of the workshop where he kept a kettle and 2 mismatched mugs and made 2 cups of tea. He set one on the workbench beside her. She didn't look up. He went back to his documentation. He photographed components. He made notes in the composition book. He did his work. Behind him, in the quiet of the workshop, the only sound for a long time was the occasional turning of a page. She read for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Nathan knew the exact duration because he tracked time in the workshop the way mechanics track it, not by clock watching, but by task completion, by the rhythm of work. He finished his documentation of the front suspension components, moved to the brake assembly, completed 2 sections of his written assessment, and had started on the steering rack before he heard the sound behind him that made him stop. It wasn't crying exactly. It was the particular sound of someone who has been holding something together for a long time and has finally, privately, in a moment they weren't quite prepared for, let a small portion of it go. A controlled exhale that caught on something. One sound, then silence, then the deliberate steadying of breath that people do when they've been caught feeling something in front of someone else. He didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the steering rack and gave her the privacy of the moment, the way you give someone space in a hospital waiting room even when you're sitting 2 feet away from them. The pretense of not noticing is sometimes the kindest thing. After a minute, she said, "He wrote about her birthday." Nathan set down his wrench. He turned around. Victoria was holding the journal open to a page somewhere in the middle. Her eyes were dry. She'd managed that, but the redness around them was recent and visible. She had the particular composure of someone who has decided to be composed and is working at it actively. February 12th, 1982, she said. Her voice was steady but effortful. He wrote about her birthday. My birthday. She looked down at the page. He missed it. He was in the middle of the axle shaft fabrication and he missed it. And he writes about... She stopped, swallowed. He describes the cake. Claire told him about it afterward. He writes about the cake he didn't see. In engineering notes. Between measurements. Nathan said nothing. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be inadequate. He describes the cake, she said again, more quietly, like she was still processing the specific strangeness of it. A man who kept engineering journals and put his daughter's birthday cake in them because it had to go somewhere and there was nowhere else. She closed the journal, set it on the workbench. She looked at her own hands for a moment, a habit Nathan had noticed she shared with Marcus Webb, this looking at one's hands when organizing thoughts, and he wondered briefly if it was something people did when they needed to locate themselves. I need to ask you something, she said. Okay. And I need you to answer me honestly, not diplomatically, not... She made a small gesture that meant she wasn't interested in careful professional language. Honestly. I'll do my best, Nathan said. Did you know? When you were at the estate, when you were looking at it in the garage. She met his eyes. Did you know what it was? No, he said. I knew it was unusual. I knew it had been built differently than a production vehicle. I knew the craftsmanship was wrong for what it was supposed to be. He paused. I didn't know what it was. I just knew it was something. She held his gaze, measuring the answer against whatever internal instrument she used for this purpose. And when she stopped, started again. When I gave it to you, the way I did, yeah, you still didn't know. I had a suspicion by that point, but no, I didn't know. She nodded slowly. She looked at the vehicle, fully in frame now in this part of the workshop, more assembled than when she'd last seen it, the rust-eaten body panels cleaned back to reveal the actual metal beneath, the interior partially disassembled and documented. It looked different in proper light, with a person who knew what they were seeing. It looked like what it was. I need to tell you something, Victoria said. She said it the way people say things they've been deciding whether to say. What I did at the auction, the way I presented you with it, in front of everyone. You don't have to... I do, actually. Her voice was firm in a way that suggested she'd decided on this before she came. It was cruel. That's the right word for it. I was performing for an audience at your expense, and I knew it was cruel while I was doing it, and I did it anyway. She looked at him directly. I do that. I have done that for most of my adult life. Use people as props when it suits me. I'm not... She paused. I'm not proud of it. I want you to know that I know what it was. Nathan was quiet for a moment. This was not what he'd expected. He'd expected the lawyers, the offer, the negotiation. He'd braced himself for that. He hadn't braced himself for this. I appreciate that, he said, because it was true. and because he didn't have a better answer ready. "I'm still going to ask you to sell it back to me," she said. And there it was. The directness that he'd somehow already known was under the surface of her, even from the night of the auction, even through the performance of it. "I want to be honest about that, too. I want it back. It's my father's. It's the most important thing he ever made, and it's been sitting in my garage for 40 years, and I gave it away because I thought—" She stopped, set her jaw. "I thought I knew what things were worth." That was the phrase, wasn't it? In front of all those people. She looked at the car again. "I was wrong. Obviously, I was wrong. And now I'm asking you, not through lawyers, what it would take." Nathan stood up from the stool. He walked to the workbench where the tea mug still sat and picked his up, though it was long cold. He held it and thought about what he wanted to say and how to say it accurately. "Money isn't the question," he said. "It has to be part of the question." "Sure, but it's not the whole question." He set the mug down. "I've spent 2 months with this car, with those journals. I know what your father built, and I know approximately what it's worth at auction, and I've thought about what to do with it every day since I figured that out." He looked at her. "And what I've come to is this. The car is mine, legally, clearly, in front of witnesses. But the story in those journals, that's yours. What he was thinking, what he regretted, what he hoped for you at, that doesn't belong to me. I can't sell you that because I never owned it." Victoria was quiet. "What I want," Nathan said, "is for the truth of what this vehicle is to be properly documented and recognized. Not for me, for your father. He built something extraordinary and then spent 30 years hiding it because he had no other choice, and the world never knew it existed. I want the world to know it existed." He paused. "And then I want to decide what to do with it in a way that does something useful. For people who need something useful done." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not going to just sell it." "I'm going to sell it, but not to you, not in private." He held her gaze. "At auction, the right way, with proper documentation and provenance and the full story of where it came from and who built it." He paused again. "And I'd like you to be part of that story. Not because I need you to be, but because it's the truth. And the truth of it is that your father built this and you're his daughter, and that matters." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. It had weight to it. Not tension exactly, more like the quality of air before a decision is made, when everything is still possible and nothing has closed yet. Victoria looked at the journal on the workbench. She looked at the photographs. She looked at the letters, still bundled with the piece of twine Nathan had used to rebind them after the original rubber band disintegrated. "The letters," she said. "You said they were letters he never sent." "That's what the journal indicates. He wrote them and kept them. Never mailed them." "To who?" "To you," Nathan said. "Most of them." She closed her eyes for a moment, just briefly, then opened them. "Can I take them?" she asked. "Not the journal, not the photographs. Those are part of the provenance. But the letters. Can I—" "They're yours," Nathan said. "They've always been yours. He wrote them to you." She reached out and picked up the bundle with both hands, carefully, the way you handle something that could break even though it won't break, because the care is the point. She held them against her chest for a moment. Then she straightened her posture, the old habit of it, and said, "Tell me what you need from me to make the auction work properly." That was the conversation that changed the direction of things. Over the following 6 weeks, Nathan, Victoria, Marcus Webb, Sandra Park, and a growing team of automotive historians, provenance specialists, and auction house representatives assembled what Webb later described as the most comprehensively documented vehicle sale he had been involved with in 3 decades of the business. Every component was photographed, tested, and cataloged. The metallurgical analysis was expanded. 3 additional materials scientists reviewed Dr. Osei's work and confirmed her findings with independent data. The engineering records that Nathan had traced through the archives, the trade publications, the patent filings, the correspondence, were gathered and organized into a formal historical document that ran to 214 pages. The journals became central to it. Not in their entirety. Nathan and Victoria had agreed, in a conversation that took place over 2 cups of coffee in the workshop 3 weeks after the Thursday meeting, that certain entries were private and would remain private. The birthday cake entry, the refrigerator photograph, the Christmas entries from 1982, those stayed out of the public record. But the engineering documentation within the journals, Edward Ashford's technical thinking, his fabrication notes, his description of the materials and processes he'd used, those became part of the provenance package, because they told the story of the car in the only way that mattered, from the inside. The press was another matter. The story, once it had broken in the automotive press, refused to leave. It migrated from trade publications to mainstream outlets to television, picking up details and momentum with each iteration. Nathan did one interview, a single print interview with an automotive history journal conducted by email. His answers brief and factual, and otherwise declined all requests. Victoria did 2 interviews, and they were different from anything Nathan had seen from her before. She was still composed, still precise, but the performance quality was gone from it. She talked about her father in terms that were honest about the distance between them. She talked about the journals in terms that were honest about what finding them had meant. She did not mention Nathan in ways that were flattering or unflattering. She mentioned him accurately, which he appreciated more. One morning, about 3 weeks into the preparation process, Lily came into the workshop after school and found 3 journalists standing outside and photographed the front door. She came inside without acknowledging them and set her backpack down and said, "There's people outside again." "I know." "Why do they keep coming?" "Because the story keeps getting bigger." She sat on her bucket and pulled out her homework. She was quiet for a moment, working through something. "Are you famous now?" "No," Nathan said. "Mrs. Briggs says you're famous." "Mrs. Briggs is kind." Lily looked up from her homework. "Are you going to be on TV?" "I'm hoping not." She appeared to consider this in the assessing way she had. "Is the lady coming again? The Victoria lady?" "Probably. We're working on some things together." "She seems different than you described." Nathan looked at her. "I didn't describe her." "You described her that first night, when you came home from the auction. You were in the kitchen and you thought I was asleep." Lily's expression was entirely neutral. "I wasn't." He stared at his daughter for a moment. "I need to start checking your bedroom before I have phone calls." "Probably," she agreed. She went back to her homework. He went back to work. But he thought about that for a while. The difference between who Victoria had been on that first night and who she was 6 weeks later. Whether people changed, or whether they revealed themselves, or whether those were the same thing described from different angles. He didn't arrive at a conclusion. He rarely did with questions like this. He just held them. Victoria came to the workshop on a Thursday again. Thursdays seemed to have become their day, by accident or by scheduling convenience. He wasn't sure which. She came to review the provenance documentation, which was now close to final. They sat at the workbench with the 214-page document between them, going through sections. Nathan had developed over the weeks a working shorthand with her, the kind that develops between people who have spent a lot of time on a shared problem, where you can indicate a question with a look and an answer with a nod, and not every exchange needs to be verbal. It was in the middle of reviewing the technical section that she stopped and said, without looking up from the document, "I read all the letters." He waited. "There were 31 of them," she said. "He wrote 31 letters to me over the course of about 10 years and never sent any of them." She was still looking at the document. "The last one was dated 1991. I was 9 years old." Nathan didn't say anything. "In the last one, he says he's going to stop writing them and start talking instead." She turned a page of the document, but he didn't think she was reading it. "He didn't. Stop writing them, I mean. He wrote 12 more after that. The last one is from 2003. "When was he diagnosed?" Nathan asked carefully. 2005. "So." She set the document down, looked at the car. 2 years after the last letter. 2 years where he still had time to... She stopped. He just couldn't do it. He could write 31 letters and hide them in a car, but he couldn't say the same things in a room with me in it. "Some people are like that," Nathan said. It wasn't adequate, but it was true. "I know." She picked up her coffee mug, set it down again without drinking. I'm like that, she said quietly. I've spent my whole adult life learning to perform instead of communicate. I learned it from watching him. A short exhale. Which is, that's a complicated thing to understand about yourself. Nathan looked at her. There was something he could have said here. Something about patterns, about how we absorb from people we love even when we don't realize we're absorbing, but it felt presumptuous. He barely knew her, or he knew her in the specific and unusual way that comes from sharing someone's private grief, which is different from knowing someone in the ordinary way. The auction is in 6 weeks, he said. Not to change the subject exactly, more to give her somewhere to land. She looked at him, a small, slightly dry sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You're very practical, she said. I have a kid to feed, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then something in her face settled. Not into peace exactly, but into something more like acceptance. Yes, she said. The auction is in 6 weeks. They went back to the document. The announcement came 3 days later, a formal press release from Meridian Heritage Auctions, a house that specialized in historically significant vehicles and had been selected after a competitive process that Marcus Webb had overseen with the thoroughness of someone who had been in this business long enough to know that the wrong house could cost you several $1,000,000 and a great deal of dignity. The release was precise and factual and contained exactly as much information as Nathan and Sandra Park had agreed to share, which was, the vehicle was the Meridian prototype, missing since 1983. It had been recovered and restored in Connecticut. It would be offered at auction in New York in 6 weeks. Full provenance documentation was available to qualified bidders on request. The reaction was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The automotive world had already been following the story, but the formal announcement transformed following into active pursuit. Collectors contacted Meridian Heritage within the first 48 hours. Museums, 3 of them, including one in Germany and one in Japan, made preliminary inquiries. 2 major automotive manufacturers sent representatives. The press descended on the story with renewed energy, running pieces that ranged from technically precise assessments of the prototype's engineering significance to considerably less precise human interest angles about the single father who had found a fortune in a billionaire's garage. Nathan read none of the human interest pieces. Sandra Park read them all and reported back with the dry efficiency of someone doing surveillance. They're going to want to photograph Lily, she said on the phone one evening. No, he said. I know. I'm just telling you so you're prepared. No, he said again. I heard you. I said, I know. He did have to have a conversation with Lily about it, though. Not a long one. He sat with her at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning and explained, as clearly as he could, that the story about the car was going to be in a lot of places for the next few weeks, and that some of it was going to be about him, and that he needed her to know that before she heard it from other kids at school. Lily listened with her full attention, the way she always listened, the complete focus that sometimes unnerved adults who expected children to be distractible. Are you going to be rich? She asked when he finished. There's going to be some money, yeah, if the auction goes well. How much money? He told her approximately. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's a lot. Yeah. What are you going to do with it? He had been thinking about this for weeks. He had talked about it with Sandra Park, with Dennis, with Marcus Webb, in a tangential way during a longer conversation about the auction process. He had thought about it at 2 a.m. more times than he could count. Some of it will make things easier, he said, for us. But most of it, I want to do something with it that matters. Something for other people. Lily nodded. She appeared to find this acceptable. She was quiet for another moment, then said, The Victoria lady. Is she going to be okay? He looked at his daughter. Why do you ask that? Because she gave something away that she didn't know was important, and then it turned out to be the most important thing. Lily said this simply, without drama. That would make me feel bad, for a long time. Nathan looked at her, 8 years old. He thought about who she was going to be when she was 30. She's working on it, he said. Lily nodded again. Good, she said, and went back to her cereal. The week before the auction was the worst week. Not because anything went wrong, Nothing went wrong, which was its own particular kind of tension, the kind where you're waiting for the thing that hasn't happened yet, and the waiting is worse than the thing would be. The vehicle had been transported to New York under specialized conditions. Insured for a figure Nathan tried not to think about too hard. The provenance documentation was finalized. Marcus Webb had done 3 television interviews with the careful precision of a man who understood exactly how much to say and how to say it without either overselling or underselling. The bidder registration at Meridian Heritage was running well ahead of projections. Nathan drove to New York the morning of the auction. Lily stayed with his sister-in-law, as she had occasionally done since the early days of the project, though this time there were phone calls and texts every 2 hours rather than the usual check-in at bedtime. He drove alone, in his own car, which was 15 years old and had a heating system that worked intermittently and a crack in the passenger side mirror he'd been meaning to fix for 8 months. He'd thought about renting something better for the occasion and decided against it. He didn't know exactly why, but it had felt important to arrive in his own car. Dennis met him in the parking garage of the auction house, already there, already in the corduroy jacket. "You're wearing the jacket," Nathan said. "I always wear the jacket." "I know." Dennis looked at him. "How are you?" "Nervous," Nathan said. He didn't say it like it was a confession, just a fact. "Good," Dennis said. "Nervous means you understand what's at stake." "I've understood what's at stake for 2 months." "Then the nervous is appropriate." Dennis clapped him once on the shoulder. The specific economical gesture of a man who isn't given to physical expression but understands when it's warranted. "Let's go in." The pre-auction viewing was open for 2 hours before the sale. Nathan moved through it in a way that felt strange and slightly out of body. His vehicle, the thing he'd found in the corner of a garage and towed to his workshop on a flatbed, now sitting under gallery lighting in a space that smelled of money and careful climate control, surrounded by collectors and dealers and historians who spoke about it in the careful appraising language of people for whom this was professional territory. He heard himself described twice as the restorer, once as the discoverer, once by a man in a very good suit who clearly hadn't read the full story as an investor. He didn't correct any of them. He moved through the room and looked at the car and tried to hold in his head simultaneously what it had been: rust-eaten, dismissed, hidden in a corner with a key on a pegboard, and what it was now, here, in this room, with these people using these words. He was looking at the rear quarter panel, the hand-finished seam that had first caught his attention in the Ashford garage, now cleaned and properly lit so that the extraordinary precision of it was fully visible, when he heard Victoria's voice behind him. "It looks different here," she said. He turned. She was standing a few feet away, alone, her arms crossed loosely. She was looking at the car with an expression he'd learned to read over the past weeks, the one that was complicated, that had several things in it at once. "Different how?" he asked. "Smaller," she said, and then after a moment, "more real." She came to stand beside him, both of them looking at the rear panel. "I keep trying to picture him doing this," she said quietly. "The handwork. Young. In that little shop in New Jersey." A beat. "He had good hands, I remember that. He could fix anything mechanical. He'd do it himself even when he could have paid someone, all the way through my childhood. Fixing the dishwasher, the car, the furnace. I used to think it was about the money when I was young, that he was being cheap." She shook her head. "It wasn't about the money." "No," Nathan said. "He just liked doing it," she said. "He liked the feeling of something broken being fixed." They were quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" Nathan asked. He asked it the way his daughter had asked him, the week before. Not as a pleasantry, but as a real question. Victoria considered it. "I will be," she said, which was a different answer than yes, and more honest, and he respected it. The auction started at 7 o'clock. Nathan sat in the back row with Dennis and Sandra Park and Marcus Webb, which was a better configuration than being at the front because it meant he could see the room rather than being seen by it. He had been in auction rooms before, smaller ones, regional ones, the occasional estate sale where a vehicle had ended up as part of a broader lot. But nothing like this. The room held 240 registered bidders and a further crowd of observers and press. The energy in it was the particular energy of money in motion, contained, focused, running just below the surface of the professional composure everyone in the room was working to maintain. The auctioneer was a precise woman with a flat London accent who handled the early lots with efficient authority, moving the room through 3 other vehicles before the Meridian prototype was brought into position. Nathan watched it come in. Watched the room watch it come in. Watched the particular stilling that happens when people who know what they're looking at see the thing they've been told about and understand, in the instant of seeing it, that the telling had not overstated. Dennis, beside him, exhaled slowly. "Yeah," Nathan said quietly. The auctioneer began. The opening bid was placed at $2 million, which drew a sound from the room, not a gasp exactly, more like a collective readjustment. The second bid came within 4 seconds, then a third. Then 4 bidders were active simultaneously, and the auctioneer's cadence sharpened with the room's energy, the numbers climbing with a momentum that Nathan had understood was possible from Webb's assessments, but that watching in real time was something else entirely. 3 million. 3.4. 3.8. A bidder dropped out. 2 more entered. 4.2. 4.7. Dennis put his hand over his mouth in the way he did when he was trying to stay neutral and not quite succeeding. Sandra Park was making notes on a legal pad with the focused calm of someone for whom numbers at this scale were professional rather than personal. Nathan watched her write and thought about what the numbers meant in practical terms, in school fees and workshop rent and the specific plans he'd been forming and revising and refining over the past 6 weeks. 5.1. 5.6. A second bidder dropped out. 2 remained. The room had gone very quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the significant thing is happening and everyone present knows it. 6 million. 6.4. 6.7. Nathan looked at the car under the gallery lighting, at the rear panel with the hand-finished seam, at the specific geometry of it, the engineering language of a man building something that had never been built before, alone in a workshop in New Jersey in 1981, while his daughter was home with her mother learning to say a word that might have been dad. 7 million, 7.3, 7.8. The second-to-last bidder hesitated. The auctioneer let the pause breathe. 3 seconds, 4, and then the remaining bidder raised their paddle once more. 8.2 million. Silence. The auctioneer's voice, level, precise. 8.2 million? Do I have 8.3? The hesitating bidder set their paddle down. 8.2 million, fair warning. Nothing. Sold. At $8.2 million. The room exhaled. Then the sound that follows, not quite applause, but the collective release of held energy, the murmur of 240 people at once, the professional congratulations, and the press moving, and the auctioneer already moving on with the cool efficiency of someone for whom this was a good evening's work. Nathan sat in the back row and didn't move for a moment. Dennis looked at him. "You okay?" "Yeah," Nathan said. His voice came out level. He was slightly surprised by that. 8.2, Dennis said. He said it the way you say something you need to hear out loud before it becomes real. 8.2, Nathan said. Sandra Park closed her legal pad. "I'll be in touch tomorrow," she said. "With the paperwork." "Yeah," Nathan said. "Thanks, Sandra." She left. Webb appeared at his shoulder briefly, shook his hand, said something about a remarkable evening, and moved off toward the room's center where the buyer was being congratulated by a small cluster of people. Dennis and Nathan sat in the back row while the room began its post-auction circulation, the sound rising again to the normal level of people who had finished waiting and were now discussing what they'd seen. "What are you going to do tonight?" Dennis asked. "Drive home," Nathan said. "Pick up Lily in the morning." "You should celebrate." "I'll celebrate when I've slept." He paused. "And when I've figured out what comes next." Dennis nodded. He looked at the car one more time, across the room, lit up and surrounded now by people wanting to be near it. "Edward would have been something to know," he said. "Yeah," Nathan said. "I think he would have." They sat there a minute longer, Two men in a room full of wealth and noise, not saying anything else. Sometimes the silence after a thing is the most honest response to it. Sometimes you've already said everything that needs saying, and the sitting is enough. Nathan drove home alone that night through the dark Connecticut roads, the car's heater working intermittently and the radio on low, and he let himself feel the whole shape of the last 2 months, the rust and the keys and the laughter in the garage, the journal and the compartment and the entry about the birthday cake, Victoria reading at the workbench with her hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea, Lily asking if the woman had been wrong. She was wrong, he'd said. He'd been right about that. He hadn't known yet how right. He drove and thought about what a man builds and what he leaves behind, and whether the two are ever the same thing. He didn't have an answer, but he had $8.2 million and a daughter who wanted to know what he was going to do with it. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt less like a calculation and more like a question he was genuinely glad to be asked. He slept for 11 hours the night he got back from New York, which was more than he'd slept in a single stretch in probably 2 years. He woke up at 9:30 to 3 missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. One text from Sandra Park with a list of next steps that ran to 14 bullet points, and a voicemail from Dennis that consisted entirely of the words 8.2, followed by the sound of Dennis apparently setting the phone down while still recording, a full 12 seconds of what sounded like his television in the background, and then the call ending. Nathan lay in bed for a few minutes and looked at the ceiling and waited to feel different. He felt tired. He felt like a man who had driven 2.5 hours in a car with an intermittent heater after a high-stakes evening. He felt the particular residue of sustained tension that doesn't lift all at once but slowly, over days, like a bruise fading. He felt, underneath all of that, something he couldn't immediately name. Not happiness exactly. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than either. He lay there a few more minutes trying to identify it and eventually gave up and got out of bed. He picked up Lily from his sister-in-law Renata's house at 11. Renata was his late wife's younger sister, 41 years old, a high school biology teacher, practical and direct in the way of someone who had learned that directness was kindness in most situations. She had kept Lily's life stable in ways Nathan would never be able to fully account for. She had also never once, in the 3 years since the accident, made him feel that he owed her for it, which was a specific and unusual generosity. When he knocked, she opened the door and looked at him and said, "You look terrible." "Good morning to you too. Did you sleep?" "Yes." "More than 4 hours?" 11. She blinked. "That's a lot for you." It was a long few months, and Lily appeared in the hallway behind Renata, still in pajamas, even though it was nearly noon, with her marine biology book tucked under one arm and an expression of careful neutrality that meant she was trying not to ask immediately and giving it about 30 more seconds before she failed. "Hey, Bug," Nathan said. "Hey." She lasted about 4 seconds. "How much?" 8.2 million. She stared at him. Then she looked at Renata, then back at him. "Million," she said. "With an M." "With an M." Renata put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were doing something she clearly hadn't planned on. "Aunt Renata's crying," Lily observed. "I'm not crying," Renata said, clearly crying. "It's okay," Lily said, with the pragmatic compassion of someone who had spent considerable time around adult emotions and had developed a working framework for them. She patted Renata's arm once, efficiently, and then looked back at her father. "Can we get breakfast? I want to talk about what you're going to do with it." Nathan looked at his daughter. He looked at Renata, who was composing herself with the slightly embarrassed dignity of someone caught feeling something. He looked at the morning, gray and cold, a little snow still on the ground from the week before. "Yeah," he said, "let's get breakfast." They went to the diner on Chester Street, the same one Dennis got coffee from, the one Nathan had been going to since before Lily was born, with the vinyl booths and the laminated menus and the waitress named Gloria, who had been there for as long as Nathan could remember, and who always gave Lily extra hot chocolate without being asked. Renata came too, because Lily asked her to, and because Nathan had no reason to say no. They sat in the back booth and ordered, and while they waited for the food, Lily opened her composition notebook. She had taken to carrying one in imitation of Nathan, though she used hers for a mixture of biology notes, drawings, and what appeared to be an ongoing list of questions about the world that she intended to answer eventually, and set it on the table. "Okay," she said. "So what are you actually going to do?" "What do you mean, actually?" "You keep saying you want to do something useful, with people who need it, but that's not a plan. That's a feeling." She held her pen ready. She was 8 years old and running a meeting. "What's the plan?" Nathan looked at Renata, who was watching this with the expression she always wore when Lily said something that reminded her of her sister. A specific tenderness that had grief under it and something like pride on top. "I've been thinking about a workshop," he said. "A real one. Not just my space, something bigger. A place where people can learn restoration work. Practical skills. Young people who don't have a lot of options." Lily wrote this down. "How many people?" "I don't know yet. That's what I need to figure out." "Where?" "Here. Millfield. Maybe expand later, but start here." "Who teaches them?" "Me, and people I'd hire. Mechanics, fabricators, specialists." Lily was writing steadily. "What do they get at the end?" "Certification and skills, and a connection to the industry. References, recommendations, actual work if they want it." He paused. "The goal isn't to teach people to be nostalgic about old cars. The goal is to teach them to solve problems with their hands. That translates to a lot of things." Lily wrote for another moment. Then she looked up. "That's actually a plan," she said. "I've been working on it." "It's a good one. Thank you." "You should have a scholarship for girls," she said. Not as an argument, as an addition. "That was already in the plan." She looked at him with a flicker of approval, set the notebook aside. "Okay," she said. "Good." Renata cleared her throat in the way she did when she had something to say and was deciding whether the moment was right. "What about the rest?" she asked carefully. "After the academy, there'll still be significant money remaining." "Some of it goes to basic things," Nathan said. "The house, stability, Lily's education." He looked at his daughter. "College, whatever she wants after." Lily appeared to find this acceptable, though she was clearly more interested in the academy portion. "And some of it," Nathan said, "I'm going to talk to Victoria about." Renata raised her eyebrows slightly. You two have been working together more than I expected." "The car was her father's. Whatever I build with part of what it earned, I want her involved in that, in choosing it." He paused. "She needs to do something with what she found in those journals. I can see that. She's working it out. And I think if she had something concrete to put it into..." He stopped. "That's probably presumptuous." "It's probably right," Renata said quietly. They ate breakfast. Gloria brought extra hot chocolate for Lily without being asked. The diner was warm and smelled like coffee, and the kind of food that people make because it's reliable rather than impressive. And Nathan sat in the vinyl booth with his daughter and his dead wife's sister, and the morning outside turning slowly from gray to something lighter, and he thought about what it felt like to have a future that had specific shape to it. The next 2 weeks were dense with logistics. Sandra Park's 14-bullet-point text expanded into a series of meetings, conference calls, and documents that Nathan signed with the focused attention of someone who does not fully understand all the language, but understands the importance of understanding the language, and so reads everything twice. The auction proceeds, after fees and commissions, and the various necessary deductions that Sandra outlined with brisk efficiency, would settle at approximately $7.1 million in net proceeds. Nathan looked at the number for a while. Then he made a list. Dennis came to the workshop on the Thursday after the auction, which was now just a regular Thursday because the car was gone and the space was empty and the workshop had returned to its usual function. A current project in the corner, a partially rebuilt transmission on the bench, the composed working quiet that Nathan had always associated with the space. Dennis looked at the empty spot where the prototype had stood for 2 months. "Weird," he said. "Yeah," Nathan agreed. "Bigger than I remembered." "You always think the space is smaller when something's in it." Dennis walked over and stood in the empty space for a moment, looking at the floor where the vehicle had rested. There were marks from the jack stands. He crouched down and looked at them with the attention of someone reading something. "What do you feel?" he asked. "Now that it's done." Nathan was at the bench working on a carburetor from the current project. He thought about the question. He thought about the drive home from New York and the ceiling in his bedroom and the unnamed thing he'd felt lying there. Like something was completed, he said, that needed to be completed. A pause. Not mine, his, Edward's, something he started in 1981 and left unfinished, not by choice, the story of what he built. It was just sitting there, incomplete, hidden in a garage. He set down the carburetor. And now it's not. Dennis was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to keep doing this? Restorations?" "It's what I do," Nathan said. "Even after—" Dennis gestured vaguely at the dimensions of what had happened. "Especially after," Nathan said. "This is the work. What happened with the Meridian is— that was once. That's not the work. The work is this." He picked up the carburetor again. "And the academy." Dennis looked up. "Tell me about the academy." So Nathan told him. The full version. The plan as it had solidified over the previous 2 weeks, through conversations with Lily and Renata and Sandra, and a preliminary discussion with a property developer who had a building on the south end of Millfield that was commercially zoned and sitting empty. He talked about the curriculum he'd been sketching out, the staffing model, the partnership he was exploring with the local community college for formal certification. He talked about the scholarship structure Lily had suggested. She had followed up with a written proposal, which he had taken seriously. Dennis listened all the way through without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When Nathan finished, Dennis said, "You've been thinking about this for a while." 2 months. Before the auction. Long before the auction. Dennis nodded slowly. He had an expression Nathan had seen a few times over the years. The expression of a man revising his estimation of another man upward, trying not to make it visible and not quite succeeding. "You need a master instructor," he said. "Someone with more breadth than just your specialty. You do restorations, you're excellent at it, but you need someone who covers the full mechanical spectrum." "I know," Nathan said. "I've been thinking about who." Dennis looked at him. "You've been retired for 3 years," Nathan said. "I have a knee." "The instruction is mostly stationary." "Nathan." "Think about it," Nathan said. "That's all I'm asking." Dennis made a sound that was not quite a yes and not quite a no, and was therefore, Nathan had learned, almost certainly eventually a yes. He picked up his coffee mug and changed the subject with the deliberateness of someone who needed time to arrive at a decision without the pressure of being watched arriving at it. "What about Victoria?" he asked. The question had more in it than just the words. Nathan recognized the additional weight of it. Dennis asking not just about logistics, but about the more complicated shape of things, the way this story had gone, and what was left of it now that the central event was concluded. "I talked to her last week," Nathan said. "She wants to meet, properly. Not about the car, not about provenance documentation, just to talk." "About what?" "I'm not sure exactly. She mentioned the letters. She mentioned her father's estate foundation. There's a charitable arm that's been operating on autopilot since he died, and she wants to restructure it, do something more directed with it. She asked for your input on that?" "She asked what I thought about directed giving versus broad philanthropy," Nathan said, "which I'm not an expert on, but we had a conversation." He was quiet for a moment. "She's different." Dennis said nothing. "I don't mean she's transformed or—" Nathan shook his head. "It's not like that. She's still herself. Still direct, almost to the point of bluntness. Still doesn't suffer things she finds stupid. But he looked for the word. The performance quality. The part where she was playing a character for an audience. That's quieter." "People don't change that fast," Dennis said. Not skeptically, just as a statement of observed reality. "I know. I'm not saying she's changed. I'm saying something shifted." Nathan went back to the carburetor. The letters did something. Reading what her father actually thought. Not the version of himself he presented to her, but the version that wrote at a workbench at 2 a.m. about missing her birthday. He paused. "That does something to a person." Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you—" and stopped. Nathan looked up. "Never mind," Dennis said. "Say it." "I'm not going to say it." "Dennis?" "I'm not your father," Dennis said, "and it's none of my business." "Say it anyway." Dennis looked at him with the expression of someone who is going to say it. "Are you interested in her, Victoria, personally?" Nathan held Dennis's gaze for a moment. He thought about an honest answer to that. He thought about what honest required in this case. "I don't know," he said, which probably means no, or means not yet, or means it's not the right question right now. He looked back at the carburetor. "She's going through something significant. I'm building something. Those are the things we're doing." "Okay," Dennis said. "That's it? Just okay." "You gave me a reasonable answer. I'm accepting it." Dennis drank his coffee. "If it becomes a different answer, I'm not going to pretend to be surprised." Nathan didn't respond to that. He worked on the carburetor. Dennis sat on his stool. The workshop settled back into its familiar quiet. The meeting with Victoria happened on a Saturday morning, which surprised him. He would have expected her to schedule things on weekdays, in professional contexts, the way people who have professional lives tend to do. But she texted him on Thursday and said Saturday morning if he was available, and he had Lily that Saturday, so he suggested the diner on Chester Street, and she said fine. He brought Lily because there was no particular reason not to, and because he'd stopped arranging his life around Lily not being visible. She was his daughter. People who dealt with him dealt with the fact that she existed and had opinions. Victoria arrived at 9:15 in her black car, dressed in jeans and a gray sweater, which was the least formal he'd seen her. She came into the diner and scanned the room and found them in the back booth and walked over. She stopped when she saw Lily. "Oh," she said. "I didn't know." "This is Lily," Nathan said. "She's aware of most of what's happened. She's been following the story." Victoria looked at Lily with what Nathan recognized was the particular discomfort of adults who don't spend much time around children and aren't sure of the protocol. "Hi," she said. Lily looked at her with frank assessment. "You're the lady from the auction," she said. "I am," Victoria said. "You gave him the car." "I did." Lily appeared to consider whether additional commentary was warranted and apparently decided against it. "You can sit down," she said. "I'm going to read." She held up the marine biology book as evidence of her intentions and moved to the window end of the booth. Victoria sat across from Nathan. She looked slightly uncertain in the way that certain very self-assured people look when they encounter something that falls outside their established frameworks for interaction. "She's very direct," Victoria said. "She comes by it honestly," Nathan said. Gloria brought coffee without being asked. She'd clocked Victoria as a newcomer and brought an extra cup on preemptive instinct, which was the kind of low-level social intelligence that made her the best waitress Nathan had encountered. Victoria looked at the coffee and said thank you, and wrapped her hands around the mug the way she always seemed to do with warm drinks. "I've been thinking about what you said," Victoria started, "about directed giving, the foundation." "Okay." "My father set it up in 2001, after I was old enough that he felt, I think, that he'd missed the important years and was trying to compensate through other means." She said this without particular bitterness, as observation. "It's done good work. Hospitals, universities, environmental programs. It's managed by a board that my father trusted, and they've continued in the same directions he established." She turned the mug in her hands. "I want to add something new, something that isn't about institutional philanthropy." "What kind of something?" "Skills programs," she said. "Practical education for young people who don't have access to it. Workforce training, apprenticeship models." She met his eyes. "Like what you're building." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I want to fund a significant portion of it," she said. "Not take it over. Not put my name on it in a way that makes it about me. Fund it, properly. With a commitment that runs long enough to actually make a difference." Victoria, "I can hear what you're going to say." "Can you?" "You're going to say it's too much, or that I don't owe you, or that you don't need the money. I was going to say I need to understand what you want in return," Nathan said. She stopped. "Not because I'm suspicious," he said, Because sustainable funding requires clear expectations on both sides. What do you want to come out of this? She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the table, then looked up. I want it to be real, she said. The thing I fund. I've spent a lot of years being associated with things that looked real and weren't, with causes that I supported publicly and felt nothing about privately. She paused. I read those letters, 31 letters, and what was in them, what he actually cared about, what he was actually trying to say to me, was nothing like how he lived his public life. She exhaled slowly. I don't want to do it that way. I want to do something that means something, and I want someone to hold me accountable to that. The diner was busy around them. The sounds of Saturday morning, plates and conversation, and Gloria moving between tables. Lily was reading her marine biology book, apparently absorbed, though Nathan knew her well enough to know that she was tracking the conversation at some level. I want an ongoing role, Victoria said. Not management. I'm not trying to run your program, but a seat at the table. I want to see how the money gets used. I want to know the people it affects. She paused. My father never did that. He wrote checks and attended galas and never met a single person whose life his money touched. I don't want to do it that way. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the workshop, the space he was going to build, the people he was going to teach, the specific and unglamorous and entirely real work of taking someone who had no options and giving them one. He thought about whether Victoria Ashford had a place in that. He thought about a woman reading her father's journal at a workbench, alone, turning pages. Okay, he said. She blinked. Okay, he said again. But I'm going to need you to come to the building with me this week. The property I'm looking at on the south end. I need someone who knows real estate to tell me if I'm about to make a mistake. She stared at him for a moment. Then something in her face shifted. Not the composure breaking, not the controlled surface cracking, but something underneath it warming, like light through old glass. I can do that, she said. And you're going to meet the people I teach, he said. Not for a photo opportunity, because you said you wanted to, and if you say something, I'm going to hold you to it. I know, she said. That's what I want. Lily looked up from her marine biology book. She looked at Victoria. She looked at Nathan. She looked back at her book. Good, she said to the book. Nathan and Victoria looked at each other. Victoria's mouth did something that might have been the beginning of a real smile. Not the practiced public kind. The other kind. The one that surprises the person wearing it. Nathan looked away first and signaled Gloria for more coffee. The building on the south end of Millfield had been a machine shop in a previous life, and before that a furniture manufacturing space, and it had the particular quality of industrial buildings that have been used by working people for a long time. High ceilings, heavy floors, the residue of purpose baked into the walls. It was larger than Nathan had strictly needed, and he'd been honest with himself about that. He was building for what it could become, not what it was at the start. Victoria walked through it with the focused attention of someone doing a real assessment, not a courtesy one. She asked about the HVAC system, the electrical capacity, the structural condition of the loading dock on the south wall. She pulled up zoning records on her phone and read them with the efficiency of someone who had been dealing with commercial real estate long enough that the language was native rather than acquired. Nathan watched her work. The electrical needs upgrading, she said, not looking up from her phone. Current capacity won't support a full workshop build-out. That's a significant cost. I know. I've had an estimate. From who? He told her. She made a face. Get a second estimate, she said. I'll give you a name. Okay? She walked to the center of the main floor and looked up at the ceiling. The afternoon light came through the high windows and fell at angles across the concrete. It was cold in there. The heating was minimal, set to whatever kept the pipes from freezing. It's a good space, she said. Yeah, Nathan said, I think so. For what you're describing, the curriculum, the layout, you'd want the main floor for the practical work. The east section could be classroom space. The loading dock, if you redo it, gives you vehicle access for projects. She turned in a slow circle, mapping it. You could do this in phases. Start with the main floor in one classroom. Expand when you know what you actually need versus what you think you need. That's what I was thinking. She looked at him. You were going to do all of this anyway. I was. But you're confirming I'm not missing anything obvious. She looked around the space once more. You're not missing anything obvious, she said. Then quietly, it's going to be good. What you build here. It's going to be a lot of work, he said. Most good things are. They stood in the cold building for a minute, the afternoon light moving across the floor between them. I owe you an apology, she said. She said it the same way she'd said it at the workshop, decided, without preamble. I said it before, partly, but I want to say it properly. She turned to face him. What I did at the auction was not just thoughtless. I used you to perform something for an audience. I picked you out of that room because you were the right kind of vulnerable. You didn't belong there, and I made sure everyone in the room knew it. She held his gaze. That's a particular kind of meanness, and I've done it before to other people, and I've been telling myself for years that it was just wit or confidence or whatever story I told myself about it. She paused. It wasn't. It was cruelty. And I'm sorry. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He thought about the garage, about the 20 people laughing and the feel of the key in his pocket. I accepted the apology the first time, he said. I know. I'm giving it to you again properly. He looked at her. Okay, he said. I hear you. She nodded once. She turned and walked toward the east wall, examining the structure. Nathan walked the other direction, toward the loading dock. They moved through the building separately for a while, each taking their own measure of the space, and the silence between them was the particular silence of two people who have said something real and don't need to immediately fill the air after it. When they met back in the center, Victoria said, "The second electrical estimate, call them Monday. Tell them Victoria Ashford referred you. They'll give you a fair price." Will they give me a good price because you referred me, or because they're actually fair? She considered this with what he'd come to recognize was genuine honesty. Both, she said. Probably. Okay, he said. Monday. They left the building together and stood on the sidewalk outside in the late afternoon. The street was quiet. This part of Millfield emptied on Saturdays once the industrial businesses closed for the weekend. Thank you for bringing me here, she said. You were useful. Yes, she said. I was. A small pause. I'd forgotten what that felt like. He looked at her. She was looking at the building, the plain industrial facade of it, the old sign brackets above the door where previous businesses had hung their names. What are you going to call it? She asked. He hadn't fully decided. He had a thought, which he'd had for several weeks, which he'd been carrying around without committing to. The Meridian Academy, he said. She turned and looked at him. After what your father built, he said. It seems right. She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved down the empty street, and she didn't look away from him. And in that pause, Nathan had the sense of several things happening at once. Gratitude, grief, the specific difficulty of being given something you didn't know you needed. He would have liked that, she said finally. Quietly, without performance. I think so, Nathan said. She looked at the building once more, straightened her coat. Monday, she said. For the electrician. Monday, he agreed. She walked to her car. He stood on the sidewalk until she drove away, and then he turned and looked at the building one more time. The future shape of it, the thing he was going to build inside the thing that already stood. He took out his phone, texted Lily. On my way back. What do you want for dinner? The reply came before he reached his car. Tacos. Also, I've been thinking about the scholarship criteria and I have notes. He looked at the text for a moment. Then he put his phone in his pocket, got in his car, and drove home through the late afternoon streets of Millfield, which was the town where he'd rented a workshop and raised a daughter and built a life out of what had remained after the worst thing happened, and which was about to become the town where he built something else, something that hadn't existed before. The heater worked the whole way home. That was probably nothing, but he noticed it anyway. The electrician Victoria recommended turned out to be exactly as fair as she'd said, and the second estimate came in 11% lower than the first, which Nathan noted without comment except to text Victoria a single number, the difference in dollars, to which she replied with nothing but a period, which he had come to understand was her version of "I told you so" delivered with maximum economy. Construction on the Meridian Academy began on a Tuesday in early March, 7 months after the night of the auction. Nathan had spent those 7 months doing the things that need doing before the visible work starts. The permits, the contracts, the curriculum planning, the hiring conversations, the long back and forth with the community college about the certification partnership, the structural engineering assessment, the purchase agreement on the building itself. None of it was glamorous. All of it mattered. He'd approached it the way he approached every restoration, methodically, without shortcuts, with the understanding that what you do before anyone is watching determines the integrity of what they eventually see. Dennis had said yes. He'd said it about 6 weeks after Nathan asked, on a Thursday morning in the workshop, without preamble. He'd simply walked in, set his coffee on the bench, and said, "I'll need the instruction schedule 3 weeks in advance. My knee doesn't like surprises." Nathan had said okay and gone back to what he was working on, and that was that. Lily had submitted her scholarship criteria proposal in a typed document, single-spaced, 3 pages long, which Nathan had read twice and implemented with minor modifications. She had been present at the meeting with the community college representative as a condition Nathan hadn't stated but had arranged by scheduling the meeting on a Saturday, and she had asked 2 questions that the representative hadn't expected and had been unable to fully answer, which Nathan considered a successful outcome. The construction took 4 months. It was not without problems. A plumbing issue in the east wall that added 3 weeks to the timeline. A delay in the equipment delivery that pushed the vehicle lift installation to the last possible moment. A contractor dispute over the classroom partition specs that Nathan resolved by climbing into the crawlspace himself to verify the measurements and turning out to be right, which resolved the dispute but cost him a morning and a pair of work pants. Victoria came to the site twice during construction. Both times she came on weekdays, which surprised him because he'd assumed her calendar was the kind of calendar that had no empty weekday space. The second time she came, she brought someone with her, a woman named Phyllis Garrett, who turned out to be the director of the Ashford Foundation's charitable operations, 60 years old, with the particular no-nonsense efficiency of someone who has spent decades making other people's good intentions into functioning programs. Phyllis walked the construction site with a clipboard and a set of questions that were better than the questions most people asked, and at the end of the walkthrough, she looked at Nathan and said, "We can work with this." Nathan looked at Victoria. Victoria was looking at the ceiling of the main workshop space with a neutral expression. "She doesn't give compliments often," Victoria said, still looking at the ceiling. "I'm standing right here," Phyllis said. "I know," Victoria said. The Meridian Academy opened on a Monday in early July, which Nathan had chosen because it was a week before the anniversary of his wife's death, and he decided years ago that the weeks around that date needed to contain something forward-facing, or they consumed themselves in the wrong direction. 12 students enrolled in the inaugural cohort, 9 young men and 3 young women, ranging in age from 17 to 24, from Millfield and the surrounding communities, selected through an application process that Lily's scholarship criteria had informed, and that Dennis had spent 2 weeks helping Nathan refine into something that was practical rather than idealistic, which was Dennis's specific and invaluable contribution to most things Nathan attempted. The morning of the first day, Nathan got to the building at 6:30. He told himself it was because he needed to check that the equipment was set up correctly, and the classroom materials were in order. Both of those things were true. They were not the primary reason. He stood in the main workshop space alone for about 20 minutes. The morning light came through the high windows at the same angles it had come through on the November afternoon he'd walked through the empty building with Victoria. The same geometry of it, the same quality. The space was different now. Lifts and benches and tools and the smell of a working shop, the specific aliveness of a place that is ready to be used for what it was made for. He thought about the Ashford garage, the rust-eaten car in the corner, the keys. He thought about Casper, the old German engineer who had told him to listen before talking, and who had been dead for 12 years, and whose advice had turned out to be applicable to almost everything. He thought about his wife, briefly, not with the old sharpness of it, but with the softer ache of someone who has learned to carry a weight long enough that it has become part of the body's normal posture. She would have had opinions about all of this. She would have told him he was overthinking the curriculum and underthinking the marketing. And she would have been half right. She usually was. At 6:55, Dennis arrived. He looked around the space and made the sound of someone who doesn't want to look impressed and is failing at it. "Good," he said. "Yeah," Nathan said. "Equipment looks right. I checked it twice." "I know. I'm saying it looks right anyway." Dennis hung his jacket on the hook Nathan had installed on the east wall, specifically because he knew Dennis would need somewhere to put it. He put on his work apron, a heavy canvas one he'd owned for 30 years, the leather straps replaced twice, but the body of it original. "What time do they arrive?" "8. Are you nervous?" "Yes," Nathan said. He'd stopped qualifying it. "Good," Dennis said. "Same as before. Appropriate." The first cohort arrived between 7:50 and 8:10, which Nathan noted was a reasonable distribution for a group of young people who had varying levels of experience with punctuality. They came in ones and twos, most of them looking around the space with the specific expression of people who weren't sure yet whether they were in the right place or had made a mistake by showing up. Nathan recognized the expression. He'd worn it himself at 22, walking into Casper's shop for the first time. He let them get settled, made coffee, real coffee. Not the workshop diner kind, because Lily had informed him that the quality of the coffee on the first day sent a message, and he had learned enough to take Lily's observations about messages seriously. When they were all there, 12 of them in the space between the workshop floor and the classroom partition, he stood in front of them and thought about what he wanted to say. He had written notes. He had revised the notes. He had decided not to use the notes. "My name is Nathan Carter," he said. "I restore vehicles. That's what I've done for 11 years in a shop about 6 blocks from here. Before that, I was an engineer at a firm that built industrial systems. And before that, I was a student who was told he was good with machines and should do something with that." He paused. "I'm not going to tell you this is going to be easy or that it's going to transform your life or any of that. What I can tell you is that the work you're going to learn here is real. Mechanical skills, fabrication, diagnostics, restoration. These are things that don't go away when the economy shifts. They don't get outsourced in the same way. And they are, in my experience, among the most satisfying forms of problem solving available to people who want to solve problems with their hands." He looked at them. 12 faces. Variable levels of engagement, which was honest. "Dennis Howell is going to be teaching most of your foundational mechanics," he said. "He's been doing this for 40 years and he's forgotten more about drivetrain systems than most people ever know. Listen to him." He paused. "You'll also hear from specialists throughout the year, people who know things I don't. And Dennis doesn't. Pay attention when they're here." One of the younger students, a 17-year-old named Marcus from the east side of Millfield, who had applied with a hand-drawn diagram of a carburetor he'd rebuilt at 14 from a YouTube tutorial and a junkyard donor, raised his hand. "What do we start with?" he asked. Nathan looked at him. He thought about the Ashford garage, the rust, the keys. "We start with looking," Nathan said. "Before you touch anything, before you diagnose anything, before you decide what something is or what it's worth, you look at it. You take your time. You let the machine tell you what it is." He paused. "That sounds like philosophy, and it isn't. It's the most practical thing I can teach you. Most of the mistakes I've seen people make in this work came from deciding what they were looking at before they'd actually looked." Marcus nodded like someone who'd understood something that connected to something he already half knew. "Okay," Nathan said. "Let's start." Victoria came to the academy for the first time 3 weeks after opening. She came on a Tuesday afternoon without announcement. She texted that morning to ask if she could stop by, and Nathan texted back a time. She arrived in her black car, which was beginning to feel like a known quantity in the parking lot, and came through the main door into the workshop space where Dennis was running a session on brake system fundamentals with 8 of the 12 students. She stood at the back and watched. Nathan watched her watch. Dennis, at the front of the space with a brake caliper in his hands, and the particular authority of a man who has taught the same material enough times to make it feel new on demand, was walking a student through the caliper compression with the specific patience of good teaching, not doing it for the student, not telling them what they should be feeling, but asking questions until the student arrived at the answer and felt it as their own discovery. The student was a 20-year-old named Deja, who had applied to the academy after 18 months of trying to get hired at every auto shop in Millfield and being told she could answer phones but not work on cars. She had 2 pages of notes in her lap and was currently arguing with the composure of someone who has learned that arguing your position calmly is more effective than arguing it loudly, that the caliper compression Dennis was demonstrating had a different feel on the left versus right side. Dennis stopped, looked at her, looked at the caliper, tried it again. "She's right," he said. "Good catch." He said it without fanfare, the way it's most effective, not making it a bigger moment than it was, just confirming the reality of it. She had seen something. She had said something. She had been correct. That was the whole story. Deja wrote something in her notebook. Victoria watched all of this from the back of the room without moving. Later, when the session had ended and the students had dispersed to the adjacent space for a break, Victoria came to where Nathan was standing near the tool wall, reorganizing a section of the socket set that had gotten out of sequence. "That young woman," she said. "Deja." "Yeah. She's sharp. She's the best student in the cohort," Nathan said. "By a reasonable margin. What does she want to do after?" "She wants to run her own shop. She has a business plan. She showed it to me in week 2, which tells you something." He set the socket in its place. "She's going to need capital eventually. When she's ready." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "The foundation has a small business development component," she said. "It's been underutilized. Phyllis has been on me about it." "I know," Nathan said. "I talked to Phyllis last month." Victoria looked at him. "You talked to Phyllis?" "She called me. She'd heard about Deja from the community college coordinator." He paused. "You should know that Phyllis operates somewhat independently of your awareness." "I am aware of this about Phyllis." "Okay, just checking." Victoria looked at the workshop space. The tools, the lifts, the vehicle currently on the center lift that a group of students had been working on all week. A 1987 pickup truck that Nathan had sourced specifically because it was old enough to teach mechanical diagnostics without digital systems, and broken enough to provide real problems that required real solutions. "It's working," she said. 3 weeks in. "Still, you can tell when something is working." She looked at him. "My father would have—" She stopped, started differently. "He would have come here, to a place like this. He would have found an excuse to be here." "Maybe," Nathan said. "You're here." She looked at him steadily for a moment. "I'm here," she agreed. She left an hour later. On her way out, she stopped and talked to Marcus, the 17-year-old with the carburetor diagram, for about 4 minutes. Nathan watched from across the room. He couldn't hear what they were saying. He saw Marcus's posture change during the conversation, from the slight defensive hunch of a teenager uncertain of being taken seriously to something more open, something more forward-facing. He saw him say something that made Victoria respond with what appeared to be a genuine question, leaning in slightly. He saw Marcus answer with his hands, the way people do when they're explaining something mechanical, the gesture preceding the words. He didn't know what they talked about. He didn't ask. Some conversations were their own. 4 months into the Academy's operation, a journalist from a regional magazine called Nathan to request an interview. He'd declined all the interview requests that had come in the months since the auction. There had been many, of various sizes and orientations, and he had declined them all with consistent politeness through Sandra Park's office. This one he almost declined as well. Then he read the journalist's previous work, a woman named Carla Vance, who had spent the better part of a decade writing about workforce development and education access and the specific failures of institutions to serve the people who needed them most. She wrote with the precision of someone who did the research and the compassion of someone who remembered that the research was about people. She was not looking for the human interest story of the single father who found the $1 million car. She was looking at the Academy. He called Sandra. "What do you think?" "I think the Academy needs visibility if it's going to grow," Sandra said, "and Carla Vance is the right person to provide it. Is that your legal opinion?" "It's my practical opinion. The legal opinion is that you have no exposure from the story at this point. Everything's resolved. You can talk if you want to." He said yes to the interview. It took place at the Academy, over 2 visits. 3 hours the first time, 2 hours the second. Carla Vance sat in the workshop with a recorder and a notebook and asked questions that were better than he'd expected, and he answered them with more honesty than he'd planned on. He talked about the car, but only as entry point. He talked more about what had come after: the journals, the discovery of Edward Ashford's actual interior life, the specific way that truth can be hidden in plain sight for decades until someone patient enough looks at it properly. He talked about his daughter without naming her. He talked about Dennis without quite catching himself doing it until he was already mid-sentence, at which point he committed. The interview was published 6 weeks later. Nathan read it once, found it accurate, and sent the link to Dennis, who texted back, "Don't make me read about myself in magazines." Also, this is good. The piece ran longer in the online version, with photographs Carla had taken during her visits. The workshop, the students, the tools, the particular quality of light through the high windows at different times of day. One photograph had made it to the print version, Nathan standing beside the center lift with Marcus, both of them looking at something in the engine bay of the old pickup, neither of them looking at the camera. Nathan's hand was pointing at something. Marcus was leaning in. Both of their expressions were the expressions of people looking at a problem with genuine interest in its solution. Nathan had not known the photograph was being taken. He thought that probably made it true in some way that the posed ones couldn't be. The enrollment inquiries for the second cohort began before the first cohort had finished. The first cohort completed their certification program in March of the following year, 14 months after the academy had opened, accounting for the extra time Nathan had built into the curriculum for the students who needed more time with the foundational material. The completion rate was 10 out of 12, which was a figure Nathan was honest about when people asked. 2 students had left, one because of a family situation that made continued enrollment impossible, one because the work had turned out not to be the right fit, and he didn't manufacture a success story out of either departure. 10 students, certified, real certifications, the kind that opened actual doors. Deja had already been offered a position at a restoration shop in Hartford, a proper position, not answering phones, and had negotiated her own starting salary, which Nathan learned about secondhand from Dennis, who had learned about it from Deja, who had apparently walked into the negotiation with a typed sheet of market rate comparisons that she had researched herself. She had not asked Nathan's advice about it. He found this genuinely satisfying. Marcus, the 17-year-old with the carburetor diagram, had enrolled in the community college's engineering technology program in addition to completing the academy certification, working the 2 programs simultaneously with the particular focused intensity of someone who has found the thing they're supposed to be doing. He was 19 now. He was going to be fine in ways that Nathan couldn't fully see yet, but could recognize the shape of. The completion ceremony was not a gala. Nathan had been specifically opposed to making it a gala, and Phyllis Garrett, who had offered to help organize it and had considerable experience with the gala format, had respected this with what appeared to be genuine relief. It was an afternoon event in the main workshop space, the same space where, 14 months earlier, Nathan had told 12 people to start by looking before they touched. The equipment was moved to create seating. There was food, good food, catered by a restaurant from the east side of Millfield that Deja had recommended, and that turned out to deserve the recommendation. Family members came. Dennis wore the corduroy jacket. Victoria came. She had been, over the 14 months, a more consistent presence than Nathan had initially expected and had initially privately been uncertain about. She had come to the academy 11 times. He knew the number, not because he'd counted deliberately, but because he was a person who noticed patterns. She had come to observe sessions, to meet with Phyllis about the foundation partnership, to sit in the corner during Dennis's advanced diagnostic seminar, with a notebook and the expression of someone genuinely paying attention. She had, 3 months in, begun occasionally teaching a session herself, a practical business fundamentals class that Nathan had not asked for and had initially been skeptical about and had sat in the back for the first time to assess. She was a good teacher. He was not surprised by this exactly, but he was struck by it. She taught the way she operated in the workshop space generally, directly, without condescension, with the patience of someone who had decided that patience was the job. The students responded to her in the way students respond to someone who treats them as capable. They became more capable. At the completion ceremony, she sat in the second row, not the front row, which Nathan noted without commenting on. She sat next to Renata, who had come because Lily had insisted on bringing her, and who had been introduced to Victoria 3 months earlier at a different academy event, and had apparently, in the way of Renata, decided that she had something useful to say to Victoria and had proceeded to say it. Nathan did not know exactly what had been said. He suspected it involved his late wife in some capacity. He had chosen not to inquire. Nathan spoke at the ceremony. He did not use notes this time either. He stood in front of the 10 graduates and their family members and the various academy supporters and partners who had been invited, and he said what he actually thought, which was the only kind of speech worth giving. A year ago, a journalist asked me what I hoped this place would do, he said, and I gave her an answer about skills and employment and workforce development, all of which is true and all of which matters. But that's not the full answer. He looked at the 10 people in the front rows. The full answer is that I wanted to build a place where someone looks at you and says, this person has the capacity for serious work, and we're going to take that seriously. That's what was missing, for a lot of you, when you got here. Not the ability, the recognition of the ability. He paused. I don't think I built that. I think you demonstrated it. We just made the space. He looked at Deja, who was sitting in the center of the front row with the posture of someone who has earned where they're sitting. He looked at Marcus, who was beside her, who had grown 2 inches over the course of the program and had, somewhere around month 9, stopped arriving at the academy with the slight wariness of someone expecting to be disappointed. What you do with what you know from here is yours, Nathan said. I'm not going to tell you it's going to be easy. You've been in this space for 14 months, and you've seen what serious work actually looks like, so you know better than I'd insult you by implying. He paused. But you also know what it feels like when the problem yields. When you've been in the engine bay for 3 hours and you finally find the thing and you fix it and it works, that feeling doesn't get old. I've been doing this for 11 years and it still doesn't get old. He stopped. That's all I've got. You earned this. Go use it. The room made the sound rooms make when something true has been said simply. Afterward, in the standing around with food portion of the event, Nathan found himself near the east wall with Victoria and Dennis and Renata and Lily, who had positioned herself between Dennis and the food table in a way that was strategically efficient. It was a loose, comfortable cluster, the kind that forms naturally around people who have spent enough time in each other's proximity that the proximity has become easy. Dennis was telling Renata something about the early days of the academy, a story about the plumbing disaster in week 2 that had become, as these things do, funnier in retrospect than it had been at the time. Renata was laughing in the way she laughed when she was genuinely amused rather than politely amused. The distinction was audible. Lily was eating and listening to the story with the expression of someone cataloging it for future reference. Victoria was standing beside Nathan, both of them watching the room, and she said quietly, "You did something real here." "We did," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Don't be modest on my account. I wrote checks. You built it. The checks mattered." "So did the building," she said. "There are different kinds of mattering." He looked at the room, the 10 graduates with their families, the food, the tools pushed to the walls, Dennis's corduroy jacket, the high windows with the afternoon light coming through at the angles he'd now seen in all the seasons. "Your father built something real too," he said, "in 1981. In a little shop in New Jersey, and nobody knew about it for 40 years because he hid it, and the circumstances took it away from him." He paused. "This won't get hidden." Victoria was quiet for a moment. He watched something move through her expression, it complicated, as her expressions often were, several things at once. "I got the foundation report this morning," she said. "For the year. Program outcomes, fund deployment, impact metrics." She looked down at her coffee. Phyllis wrote a section about the academy, about what the cohort accomplished. A pause. She used the word significant. That's high praise from Phyllis. It's the highest praise from Phyllis. She looked up. "I read it 3 times. Nathan looked at her. He had known her now for about 14 months, which was not a long time by most measures, but was long enough to have accumulated the specific knowledge that comes from shared work and shared difficulty, and the occasional conversation that went somewhere neither person had planned. He knew that she read important things 3 times. He knew that she arrived exactly on time and considered lateness a form of disrespect. He knew that she was, underneath the precision and the control and the careful management of her own presentation, someone who felt things more than she let most people see, and that the journals had not created this in her but had cracked the surface of the containment she'd built around it, letting some of it into the open air where it could be useful instead of just heavy. He knew that she was not done becoming someone, which was a thing you could say about very few 31-year-olds he'd met. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Going forward, with the foundation." She'd been thinking about this. He could tell by the readiness of her answer. "Expand the program. Second Academy location, probably in Hartford. Keep the partnership with you and Dennis as the model. Phyllis is already in conversation with 2 sites." She paused. "And personally, I'm going to do less performing and more working." "I know that sounds like the kind of thing people say." She looked at him. "I mean the mechanics of it. I'm going to be in rooms where the work is actually being done, not in rooms where people are talking about the work being done." "That's harder than it sounds." "I know. I've started finding that out." A small pause. "The board dinner last month, 4 hours of people congratulating each other for caring about things." She shook her head. "My father hated those dinners. I know that now. He wrote about it in the journals, 2004. He called it professional performance for an audience of mirrors." She said the phrase with a kind of weary recognition. "I've been performing for mirrors my whole adult life. I learned it from watching him perform for them, and he hated it." "People teach their children things they don't mean to teach them," Nathan said. "Yes," she said. "And then sometimes, if you're paying attention, you can unlearn them." She looked across the room at Lily, who was now sitting on the floor beside the food table, cross-legged, reading something she'd pulled from her bag, because she had apparently reached the limit of standing around with food and returned to her natural state. "She's going to be something," Victoria said. "Yeah," Nathan said. "She already is." Victoria watched Lily for a moment. Then she said without turning, "I've been thinking about your wife." She said it carefully, not intrusively, as a statement of fact about where her mind had been. "I never knew her, obviously, but from what Renata has told me and what I can see in your daughter, she was a person who understood what was real and what wasn't." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "she was. I'm sorry she's not here to see this." It was the right thing to say, and she said it simply, without decoration. Nathan looked at the room, his daughter on the floor with a book, Dennis making Renata laugh, the 10 graduates and their families, the tools pushed to the walls of the space that had once been empty and was now full of the accumulated weight of people working seriously at serious things. "She'd have opinions about the curriculum," he said. "Of course she would. She'd be right about some of them. Probably." He thought about that, not with the old sharpness, but with the warm ache that was by now a familiar part of how he carried her. He had learned over years that grief doesn't resolve into something clean. It doesn't go away or get smaller. It gets integrated. It becomes part of the structure of you rather than a wound in the structure of you. And the difference between those two things is everything. He had built this academy partly because of her. Not as tribute, not consciously, but because the instinct to build something real and lasting was something she had believed in and something he had absorbed from believing in her. These things travel, not cleanly, not directly, but they travel. Later, when most of the guests had gone and the space was being returned to its working configuration, Lily found Nathan near the tool wall, putting the socket set back in order. The same set, the same sequence, the same habit. She stood beside him and helped, passing him sockets in order the way she'd learned to do it, accurate about the sequence. "Good day?" she asked. "Good day," he said. Deja was happy. "Yeah. Marcus looks older than when he started." "He is older than when he started." "You know what I mean." She passed him another socket. "Like older on the inside." Nathan looked at his daughter. 9 years old now, nearly 10. The year had done things to her face in the way years do, the baby softness giving way incrementally to the sharper lines of the person she was going to be. She had her mother's nose and his forehead, and her own particular quality of attention, which she'd come into herself. "Yeah," he said, "I know what you mean." She was quiet for a moment, passing him sockets. "Are you going to keep doing this?" she asked. "Running the academy?" "It's what I do now," he said, "along with the other work." "Do you like it?" He thought about that honestly, the way he'd been trying to be honest with her, as consistently as he could manage, because she was old enough to receive honesty and young enough that the receiving of it was still shaping something in her. "I like it in the way I like the restoration work," he said. "Not because it's easy, because it's real. Because when it's working, you can see it working. There's no ambiguity." She nodded. She passed him the last socket. The set was complete, ordered. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "The Victoria lady." She was looking at the socket set, not at him. "She looks at you different than she did at the beginning." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you mean different?" "Like you're a person instead of a situation." She said this with the directness of a child who has observed something and is reporting the observation without editorializing. Then she added, also without editorializing, "I think that's an improvement." Nathan looked at his daughter. He considered several responses and selected none of them. "Go get your jacket," he said. "It's getting cold." She went to get her jacket. He stood at the tool wall for a moment in the emptying room, the late afternoon light coming through the high windows at its angles, the space returning to its working silence. He thought about a rust-eaten car in the corner of a garage, about a key on a pegboard and a crowd of people laughing, about a journal hidden in a compartment, hidden in a car, hidden in a garage for 40 years, waiting for someone patient enough to look properly. He thought about what Edward Ashford had written in the last entry, in the last pages of the last notebook. "I built it, and it exists, and that has to count for something." It counted for something. Nathan knew that now in a way he couldn't have known it 14 months ago. Not just as information, but as felt reality, the kind that accumulates in you through the doing of things. Edward had built the car, and the car had led to the journals, and the journals had led to the truth of a father's interior life, and that truth had found its way to his daughter, and his daughter had done something with it, imperfectly, incompletely, in the ongoing way that real change actually works. And the money from the car had built this academy, and the academy had given Deja a starting place, and Marcus an expanding horizon, and 10 other people something real to do with their ability. And it would give more to more, through the Hartford location Phyllis was already in conversation about, through the second and third cohorts, through the long compounding interest of one real thing done properly. The car was gone. What the car had started was not. That was the thing about real work, not the dramatic gesture of it, not the found fortune or the auction room or the headline. The real thing was the long aftermath, the accumulation of small, serious things done without an audience, the 14 months of showing up in a cold building and teaching people to look before they touch, the scholarship criteria that a 9-year-old had written in a composition notebook, the 4 minutes Marcus had spent talking to Victoria at the back of the workshop, and the way his posture had changed. The things that last are the things that were built to last, which means they were built slowly, with attention, with the understanding that what you do before anyone is watching determines the integrity of what they eventually see. Nathan had learned this from an old German engineer in a fabrication shop. He had practiced it in a rented workshop for 11 years. He had found it confirmed in the pages of a journal written at 2 in the morning in 1981 by a man who built something extraordinary and was afraid it would never be found. It had been found. By someone patient enough to crouch in the corner of a garage and look at a seam. He heard Lily coming back with her jacket, the particular sound of her footsteps, the way he could locate her in a space by sound without thinking about it. He heard Victoria saying something to Renata near the door, and Renata laughing at it. He heard Dennis turning off the lights in the classroom space at the back, the specific sound of the old switches, one by one. He reached out and turned off the tool wall light. The academy went quiet around him. Not empty quiet, but the quiet of a place that has been used well and is resting. The quiet of a space that knows what it's for. He stood there one more moment, just long enough to let it land. Then he went to find his daughter, and they went home.